Welcome back to the quiet apothecary. Take a slow breath, let your shoulders drop, and settle in wherever you are tonight. There is nothing here that asks anything of you, and nowhere else you need to be. There is one book on the table tonight. It is small. It would sit comfortably in a coat pocket. The paper is cheap and has gone the color of weak tea at the edges. The binding is plain, and when it was first printed in London it cost 3 pence, which was rather less than a decent pair of stockings, and rather more than a loaf of bread. On the title page, in the long crowded lettering of its century, it calls itself the English Physician. Almost nobody has called it that for a very long time. For 3.5 centuries, it has simply been Culpeper, after the man who wrote it, and in all that time it has never once been out of print. That is the whole of our evening. This book, and the man who made it, and the people who very much wished he had not. His name was Nicholas Culpeper. He kept an apothecary's shop in Spitalfields, just outside the eastern wall of London, in a street called Red Lion Street, and he saw the poor of that parish by the dozen every morning, and took no fee from most of them. He had no license from the College of Physicians, and never sought one. And in the year 1649, he did the single thing the physicians of London had never forgiven anyone for doing. He took their own book of medicines, the official one, the one written entirely in Latin, so that only they could read it, and he translated the whole of it into plain English, and sold it to anybody who wanted a copy. They wrote against him in print. They mocked him in the news books. They could not, in the end, do very much else, and the book went on selling. And then he wrote a better one, and that is the one on the table tonight. We will take all of this slowly. We have a great many hours ahead of us, and by the end of them we will have walked through a Sussex Rectory, an unfinished Cambridge education, an apprenticeship at the Mortar, a shop in the poorest quarter of the city, a battlefield, and finally, at length and unhurriedly, the herbal itself, plant by plant, planet by planet, syrup by syrup. There is no need to remember any of this. Let your attention come and go as it pleases. If you drift off somewhere in the middle of it, the book will still be here in the morning, as it has been every morning for rather a long time now. Let us begin with the book itself. It is worth spending a little while simply looking at it before we go anywhere near the man, because the object explains him better than most of his biographers have managed. Hold it in your mind as a physical thing, somewhere between the size of a hand and the size of a folded newspaper, depending on which edition you have found, since it was reprinted so many times and in so many shapes that no two copies of the early years look quite alike. The pages are thin. The type is small and set close because paper cost money, and the whole point of the enterprise was that the book should be cheap. There are no fine engraved plates in the first printings, no gold on the spine, none of the quiet luxury of the great herbals that stood in the libraries of gentlemen. This is not a book that was made to be admired on a shelf. It was made to be carried out into a garden with dirty hands. The full title of the first edition, in 1652, ran on the way titles did in that century, promising a great deal in a single breath. It offered itself as an astrologo-physical discourse of the common herbs of this nation, and it stated plainly what it was for, which was to allow a man or a woman to cure themselves of the ordinary illnesses of life, at almost no cost, using what grew within a short walk of their own door. The following year it came back enlarged, with several hundred more plants in it, and that enlarged version is essentially the book we still have. Inside, it is arranged as a catalogue, plant after plant after plant, in a rough alphabetical wander, each one given the same 4-part treatment. First, a description, so that you could recognize the thing growing. Then the place, meaning where in England it was likely to be found. Then the time, meaning the month it flowered, or the month its root was best taken up. And then the section he called Government and Virtues, which held the planet that ruled the plant and everything the plant was thought to do. That 4th section is where the book lives. It is written in a voice unlike any other herbal of the period. He argues with you. He tells you what he thinks of physicians who charge a crown for a remedy growing free in a ditch. He says a thing is good for a cough and then adds, almost as an aside, that he has used it himself and found it answered. He recommends, he warns. He occasionally loses his temper entirely and then recovers it a paragraph later. Reading him is not like reading a reference work. It is like being talked at, warmly and at length, by a knowledgeable and slightly exhausting man who genuinely wants you to be well. The price is the part most often remembered, and it deserves to be 3 pence. A serious medical book in the England of the 1650s could cost a labourer a week's wages or more, and most of them were in Latin, which put them out of reach twice over. Culpeper's book was priced so that a weaver in Spitalfields, or a farm servant in Kent, or a soldier's widow with a sick child could actually own one. It was, by a considerable margin, the cheapest medical book of its age. And then it did not stop. It was reprinted and reprinted and reprinted. New editions appeared while he was still alive, and a great many more after he was dead, some faithful and some cheerfully padded out by publishers who had noticed how well the name sold. It crossed the Atlantic. It was still being reset and reissued in the 18th century, in the 19th, in the 20th, and it is being printed now. The old claim that it has never been out of print since 1652 is one of those claims that sounds too neat to be true, and as far as anyone has ever been able to check, it is true. That is a strange thing for a small, cheap book to do. Grander herbals than his, more beautiful, more learned, better illustrated, are today the property of libraries and collectors. His is the one that stayed in kitchens. Let us turn now to why that happened, and to the quiet argument buried inside every page of it. The argument is this: he believed that medicine had been made deliberately difficult, not accidentally, not through the ordinary complexity of a hard subject, but on purpose, by people who profited from its being difficult. He believed that the herbs that could cure the common illnesses of England grew in England, in the hedges and the meadows and the waste ground behind the house, free to anyone who could recognize them, and that the only thing standing between an ordinary person and their own health was the fact that nobody would tell them which plant was which and what it did. So he told them. That was the entire project. Everything else in his life, the translation, the quarrels, the pamphlets, the long hours in Red Lion Street, with a queue of people at the door, follows from that one plain idea, held with a stubbornness that his friends found admirable and his enemies found insufferable. It also explains the shape of the writing. He never assumes a teacher. Every other herbal of the period was written for someone who had already been taught, who would use the book to check and refine what he already knew. Culpeper wrote for someone with no teacher at all. That is why the descriptions are so long and so patient, why he tells you the leaf is a little rough on the underside and the flower is the color of old butter, why he bothers to say that a plant grows in shady lanes and by old walls rather than simply naming its habitat and moving on. He is standing beside a reader who has never been shown anything, pointing. There is a small, telling detail in the way surviving copies look. Museum shelves and private collections hold a good many early Culpepers, and the ones that have come down to us are frequently in poor condition. Pages loose, corners soft with handling, margins written in several different hands across several generations, with a family's own additions, a receipt for a cough syrup, a note that this worked for the boy in the winter of such and such a year. Books that are treasured tend to survive clean. Books that are used tend to survive battered. His survive battered. It is worth remembering how few books most English households owned in that century. A great many owned none at all. Of those that owned any, the great majority owned exactly one, which was a Bible. Very often the family's single most valuable possession, kept carefully and written in at the front with the births and the deaths. Below the Bible, in the houses that could stretch to it, came the almanac, bought new every year for a penny or two, carrying the calendar, the phases of the moon, the dates of the fairs, the weather predictions, and a woodcut of the zodiac man with the 12 signs arranged down his body. Almanac sold in enormous quantities, in the hundreds of thousands annually across the country, and they were the great popular print of the age. That is the shelf Culpeper's book joined, not the physician's library, the kitchen shelf beside the Bible, and the almanac in the houses of people who owned 2 books and now owned 3. And because it sat there, and because it was consulted rather than admired, it entered ordinary English life in a way that no folio ever could. There is one more thing to notice about it before we go back to the beginning of the man himself. The title he gave it was The English Physician, and the phrase carries 2 meanings at once, both of them deliberate. It means the physician available to English people, in English, without a fee. And it means the physician made of English plants, the doctor who is the hedgerow itself. He was quite capable of that kind of double edge, and the book is full of similar small pieces of craft that are easy to miss if you read him only as a man in a temper. Let us turn now gently backwards to the beginning of him and to a rectory in Sussex where none of this was in any way expected. He was born on the 18th of October in the year 1616 at Ockley in Surrey, close to the Sussex border, into a family of clergymen and small gentry. The Culpepers were an old Kentish name with branches scattered across the southeast, some of them comfortable, some of them not, and his own branch sat somewhere in the respectable middle. His father, also called Nicholas, was a clergyman who had recently come into a living. His mother, Mary, was the daughter of a Sussex minister. His father died before he was born. The accounts differ a little on the exact interval, but they agree on the essential shape of it, which is that the older Nicholas Culpeper died within a fortnight or so of his son's birth, having barely settled into the parish he had been given. The infant arrived into a house that was already in mourning and already, in a practical sense, without a future in that place. A widow could not hold a living. There was nothing to stay for. So Mary took her son and went home to her father, and that is where he was raised. Her father was William Tattersall, the minister of Isfield in Sussex, a village a few miles north-east of Lewes on the River Ouse, and he was a considerable figure in his own quiet way. Tattersall was a Puritan of the serious, learned, hard-working kind, a man who published long commentaries on the books of the Bible, and who took the education of the young with great seriousness. He would live and preach at Isfield for the better part of 40 years. Picture the household, because it matters. A rectory in a small Sussex village. A study lined with books, most of them theological, many of them in Latin, some in Greek, and a few in Hebrew. A grandfather who worked in that study for long hours and expected silence in the house while he did. A mother, widowed young, keeping a household on a minister's charity. And one boy, growing up in the middle of it, being trained from very early on for the one profession everyone assumed he would enter, which was his grandfather's. He was taught at home, and taught hard. Latin came first and came early, drilled in the way that century drilled it, by grammar and repetition and the copying out of long passages, until the language stopped feeling foreign. Greek followed. By the time he was 10, he is said to have been reading both with reasonable comfort, which was not unusual for a clever boy in a scholarly household, but was not nothing either. The purpose of all this was clear and openly stated. He was to go to Cambridge, and then into the church, and the whole apparatus of the rectory bent towards that end. Let us turn now to the other education he was getting at the same time, the one nobody in the house was supervising. Eastfield was, and still very largely is, a place of hedges and water meadows. The Ouse runs through it. The lanes are deep and green and shaded. In the 1620s, a boy, with a free afternoon and no siblings, had a very great deal of countryside available to him, and very little to stop him wandering about in it. And the countryside of the Sussex Weald in that period was, from a herbalist's point of view, extraordinarily rich. Elder and hawthorn in the hedges, meadowsweet and comfrey along the river, betony and self-heal in the rough grass, foxglove in the wood edges, nettle and cleavers and burdock on every scrap of waste ground. More importantly, it was full of people who knew what those plants were. Every village in England had women who kept a still room of sorts, even a very modest one, a jar of rose water, a pot of ointment made with lard and elder leaves, dried chamomile in a linen bag, a syrup of coltsfoot put by against the winter cough. This knowledge was ordinary. It was not written down, and it was not respected by the learned, but it worked well enough for the ordinary run of complaints, and it was the only medicine most of those villagers would ever see. We have no diary from his childhood and no letters, so nobody can say with certainty when he began paying attention to it. But something in that landscape took hold of him early, because the herbal he wrote 30 years later is full of the kind of knowledge that does not come from books. He knows what a plant smells like when you crush it. He knows which lanes it favors. He knows that a particular root is a devil to dig in dry weather. That is field knowledge gathered slowly, on foot, over years, and the years he had for gathering it were these. His mother, by the accounts we have, had some of that household skill herself, as almost every woman of her class did, and the boy is said to have taken an interest in her small stock of remedies well before he took any interest in his grandfather's sermons. There is a story, repeated in most of the older lives of him, and impossible now to verify, that he found in Tattersall's study a copy of one of the great English herbals, and read it as other boys read tales of adventure, and that his grandfather, discovering this, was not pleased. Whether or not it happened exactly so, the shape of it is right. The books he was given and the books he wanted were not the same books. Let us turn now to the difficult question of what his grandfather actually thought of him, because it shadows everything that follows. William Tattersall was not a cruel man, so far as anyone can tell from what he left behind, but he was a rigorous one, and rigorous in a particular direction. His writing is dense, moral, uncompromising, and entirely certain of itself. He had taken in a widowed daughter and a fatherless boy, and he had given that boy an education far better than most children in England would receive, at his own cost and in his own time. He would have felt, quite reasonably, that a return was owed. The return he expected was a grandson in a pulpit. What he got eventually was a grandson who left Cambridge without a degree, married against his wishes, moved to the poorest parish in London, took up with astrologers, and made a living from trade. When Tattersall came to write his will many years later, the young man was left, according to the accounts that have come down to us, a token sum and very little else. That is a sad thread, and we will not pull on it too hard tonight. It is enough to say that the boy walking the lanes at Isfield with his pockets full of leaves was already, without either of them quite knowing it, walking away from the life that had been arranged for him. It is worth saying a word about the world of illness he grew up inside, since it shaped what he later thought was worth writing down. The Sussex Weald in the 1620s was damp, wooded, and heavily worked, with iron furnaces in the valleys, and a scattered population living close to the ground. The complaints that filled a village year were entirely ordinary and entirely relentless. Agues, meaning the recurring fevers that came off marshy ground and returned faithfully every season. Coughs that settled in through the winter and did not lift until spring. Wounds and burns and broken bones from the ordinary business of farm work. Bad teeth, bad eyes, worms in children, skin troubles from poor washing and poorer diet, difficult childbirths, and the deaths that followed them. Against all of that, a village of that size had no physician, no surgeon, and no apothecary within a considerable walk. It had a hedge full of plants, several women who knew what to do with them, and a parish register that recorded the results. A boy raised in the middle of that, watching it happen year after year in a small place where everybody knew everybody, would come away with a very particular idea of what medicine actually is and who it is actually for. Not a science practiced in a college, a practical daily necessity, unevenly distributed, and mostly absent where it was most needed. We turn now to the day he was sent north, and to the university that was supposed to settle him. In the early 1630s, at 16 or 17 years old, Nicholas Culpeper went up to Cambridge. The records, it must be said, do not tell us which college received him, and the old accounts pass over the detail as if it hardly mattered. What they do agree on is the purpose. Cambridge in those years was full of seriously Puritan houses, colleges established with the explicit intention of producing preachers, and they produced them in quantity. A grandson of William Tattersall, sent up from a rectory like Isfield, was being sent for one purpose, and everybody involved understood what that purpose was. He arrived with a very good preparation. His Latin was fluent, his Greek respectable, and he had grown up in a house where scholarship was the ordinary daily business of a grown man. He was, on paper, exactly the sort of student the college existed to receive. He did not last. Let us take this slowly, because the usual telling of it is far too quick. He was not thrown out in disgrace, and he did not fail his work. What happened was slower and more ordinary than that, and it is the sort of thing that happens to a great many clever young people who have been aimed at a career by somebody else. He found other books. The university library and the private collections of his tutors and fellow students contained a great deal more than divinity, and among that great deal more were the works of medicine. Galen, above all, the 2nd century Greek physician, whose system had governed European medicine for something like 1400 years, and would govern it for a little while longer. Hippocrates, older still, and gentler, and in some ways wiser, the Arabic writers in their Latin dress, Avicenna and Rhazes, whose vast compendia had carried classical medicine through the centuries when Western Europe had largely mislaid it. And the herbals, the great printed herbals of the previous century, thick with woodcuts, listing plant after plant with its virtues. There is no mystery about why these caught him. He already knew the plants. He had been picking them since childhood in the Sussex lanes. What he had never had was a system, a framework, a set of names and reasons that turned a boy's scattered field knowledge into something that could be called learning. In those books he found one, and the effect on him seems to have been immediate and total. Let us turn now to the system he found, because it will matter very much later, when he comes to write his own book, and it is worth understanding it on its own terms, rather than through modern eyes. Galenic medicine held that the body was governed by 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humour carried a pairing of qualities. Blood was hot and moist, phlegm cold and moist, yellow bile hot and dry, black bile cold and dry. Health was a matter of these 4 standing in their proper balance for that particular person, since the balance natural to one man was not the balance natural to another. Illness was an imbalance, an excess of one humour or a deficiency in another, and treatment meant restoring the proportion, either by removing what was in excess or by supplying what was lacking. Every substance in the world could be placed on the same map. Every plant, every mineral, every food had its own qualities and its own degree of intensity, from the 1st degree, which was very mild, to the 4th, which was violent. A herb that was hot in the 3rd degree and dry in the 2nd was, in that scheme, a precise instrument. If a patient's illness was cold and moist, you reached for something hot and dry, and the further out of balance the patient was, the higher the degree you selected. Say what one likes about whether it was correct, and it was very largely not. It was a genuine intellectual system. It was internally consistent. It explained why remedies were chosen. It allowed a physician to reason from a patient he had never seen before to a treatment he had never used before, And for a young man who had grown up knowing that comfrey was good for a broken bone, without ever being told why, the arrival of a why must have been intoxicating. Attached to the humours was a further idea that runs through his whole later work, which was the doctrine of temperaments. Every person had a natural balance of their own, and that balance gave them a character as well as a constitution. A man in whom blood predominated was sanguine, ruddy and cheerful and generous. Phlegm made a person phlegmatic, pale and slow and calm. Yellow bile made the choleric thin and quick and easily angered. Black bile made the melancholic, dark and inward and thoughtful. Those 4 words are still in the language, and we still use them to mean very much what they meant then, which is a remarkable survival for a piece of discarded physiology. For a physician, this mattered practically. The same remedy was not right for every patient, because the same remedy did not meet the same starting point. A cooling herb given to a person already cold by nature would do harm. Treating the individual rather than the disease was built into the system at the foundation, and it is one of the reasons the old medicine feels, at times, oddly modern. The other piece he would have picked up at Cambridge was the language of degrees, which sounds technical and is actually very simple. A herb hot in the 1st degree is mildly warming and safe for anyone. In the 2nd, noticeably so. In the 3rd, strong and to be used with attention. In the 4th, dangerous. Culpeper uses that scale constantly, and it functions in his book rather as a warning label functions now, telling a reader with no training how carefully to handle what they are holding. There was a 2nd system waiting for him at Cambridge as well, and this one his grandfather would have liked even less. Astrology in the England of the 1630s was not the harmless amusement it later became. It was a technical discipline with its own mathematics, its own vast literature, and its own respectable practitioners, and it was tightly bound up with medicine. The doctrine, in its medical form, held that the 7 planets of the old cosmology governed the parts of the body, the hours of the day, the course of an illness, and the plants that grew out of the earth. A physician who knew the hour a patient had taken to their bed could cast a figure of the heavens for that moment and read in it the nature of the disease and its likely course. A physician who knew which planet ruled a herb could choose that herb rationally against a disease ruled by another. Nearly every learned physician of the period had at least some acquaintance with it. A good many took it entirely seriously. It sat beside Galenic humours without any sense of contradiction, since both were systems of correspondence, both worked by matching quality to quality, and both were very old and therefore respectable. Culpeper took it more seriously than most. Whatever the first spark was, and we do not know, he seems to have gone at astrology with the same appetite he brought to the herbals, and by the end of his life he was writing books on the astrological judgment of disease, as confidently as he wrote about the making of syrups. It is the part of his work that later ages found most embarrassing, and it is entirely inseparable from the rest of it. Let us turn now to what all this reading was doing to his actual studies. Not very much good. The accounts agree that his attendance at the work he had been sent to do fell away, and that his tutors noticed. There are the usual stories attached to almost every young man of the period who left a university early, of tavern evenings and tobacco and late hours, and there is probably some truth in them, since he certainly smoked heavily in later life and certainly drank. But the stories miss the more interesting fact, which is that he was not idle. He was working extremely hard on entirely the wrong subject. It is worth pausing on how that would have felt inside the household at Isfield. Reports came south. A grandfather who had spent 17 years and a considerable share of his income building a preacher was being told that the preacher was reading Galen in his rooms and casting horoscopes with his friends. There is no record of the correspondence, but it is not difficult to imagine its temperature. There is a further thing worth noticing about those Cambridge years, which is what they gave him that he kept. He came away without a degree, without a career, and without his grandfather's approval. And he came away with a working command of Latin that was good enough, 15 years later, to translate an entire official pharmacopoeia into English at a standard nobody was able to fault. That is not a small inheritance. His enemies attacked his character, his politics, his religion and his sobriety. They did not, so far as the record shows, attack the accuracy of his translation, because it was accurate, and it was accurate because of Isfield and Cambridge. He also came away knowing exactly how the learned world talked to itself. He had sat inside it. He knew the shape of its arguments, the weight it gave to the authority of the ancients, the way a citation was used to close a question. That knowledge is all over his later writing. When he takes on the College of Physicians, he is not shouting at a door from the outside. He is a man who has been in the room, who knows what is said in there and what it is worth, and who is therefore very difficult to intimidate with the sound of it. It made him, in a way that is not entirely comfortable, a man of two worlds and fully at home in neither. Too learned to be a simple country herbalist, too irregular and too poor, and too openly furious to be admitted anywhere near the profession his learning had fitted him for. He spent his whole working life in the gap between the two, and the book he eventually wrote is a book that could only have been written by somebody standing exactly there. Let us turn now to the year everything came apart, and to a road outside Lewes in a summer storm. Here we must slow down and be careful, because what follows is the most famous story about Nicholas Culpeper, and it is also the one for which the evidence is thinnest. It comes to us from a life of him, published some years after his death, in a volume put out under his name by people with an interest in selling books, and it has been repeated by almost everyone since, growing a little more polished with each retelling. Modern historians treat it with a good deal of caution. The old books tell it as fact. We will tell it as the old books tell it, and then say plainly what we do not know. The story is this. While he was still at Cambridge, or perhaps home in Sussex between terms, he fell in love. The young woman is named in the older accounts as Judith Rivers, the daughter of a wealthy family of the Sussex gentry, and by every version of the tale the attachment was serious on both sides and entirely impossible in the eyes of her parents. He was a fatherless student with no fortune and no living. She was an heiress. There was no version of a formal courtship that would have been permitted. So they arranged. As young people in that situation have always arranged to solve the problem themselves. They would meet secretly, marry without permission, and present the families with an accomplished fact. A place was fixed, somewhere on the road towards Lewes. A day was fixed. He is said to have sent her a sum of money to help her travel, and to have gone to the meeting place to wait. She never arrived. The storm came up while she was on the road. Summer thunder in the Weald can be sudden and very violent, and the account says that her coach was struck by lightning, and that she was killed instantly. He waited, and then he learned, and then, by every version of the story, he broke. That is the tale. It is a good tale, almost too good, and the shape of it belongs as much to the bollard tradition as to biography. What can be said with more confidence is simply that something ended his Cambridge career abruptly and permanently, that he left without taking a degree, that his relations with his grandfather never recovered, and that the young man who came out of Sussex afterwards was not aiming at a pulpit anymore. It is worth being clear about why the caution is needed, since it is a good illustration of how these old lives were made. The account first reaches print some years after his death, in a book put out under his name by a trade that had discovered how well that name sold. Nobody has ever produced a parish record, a family paper, or a letter confirming the young woman, the engagement or the death. The details that are given are the details a bollard gives. A secret meeting, a thwarted love, a storm sent at exactly the wrong moment, and the story performs a very convenient service for a publisher, which is to explain, in one sympathetic stroke, why a promising young man of good family ended up an unlicensed tradesman in a poor parish. None of which makes it untrue. Lightning does strike travellers, and it struck a great many more of them in a century, when everybody travelled slowly and in the open. Elopements were attempted constantly and went wrong regularly. It may have happened more or less exactly as described. The honest position is simply that we do not know, and that we should hold it loosely, and that it has been retold so often, and so warmly for so long, that it has become part of him, whether or not it ever happened at all. Let us turn now to the aftermath, whatever its cause. He seems to have been ill for a considerable time. The accounts speak of a long collapse, a sickness of grief, a period of months during which he could not or would not do anything at all. If we set aside the lightning entirely, and simply say that a young man of 18 suffered a serious loss and a serious breakdown, we are on ground nobody disputes. What we know follows is that a decision was made about him. He could not return to Cambridge. He could not be kept at Esfield indefinitely doing nothing. And there was one obvious use for a boy who had ruined a divinity education by reading medicine, which was to put him into the medical trade at the only level his family could reach. They could not make him a physician. That road ran through the universities and the college. It required a degree, and it required money and connections that the household at Esfield did not have, and would certainly not now spend on him. What they could do was apprentice him to an apothecary. It was trade rather than a profession, and a grandfather with William Tattersall's opinions would have felt the drop in status keenly. But it was respectable trade. It was skilled, and it would keep a young man in bread. His mother is said to have raised the fee, or a part of it, from her own small resources. And so, at some point in the middle 1630s, a young man in his late teens travelled from a quiet Sussex village to the largest and dirtiest city in England, carrying with him a good classical education he was never going to use for its intended purpose, a considerable knowledge of English plants, an enthusiasm for Galen and the planets, and, if the old books are right, a grief he never entirely put down. It is worth being careful in a story like this one, about the temptation to make everything explain everything else. It would be neat to say that a young man who lost the woman he loved, therefore, spent the rest of his life treating the poor for nothing, and biographers have said very nearly that, and there is no evidence for it whatever. People are not that tidy. What can be said is narrower and probably truer. Whatever happened in his 18th year closed off the life that had been planned for him, permanently and against his family's wishes, and left him free in the way that only people with nothing left to lose are free. There is a second, quieter consequence, and it runs through everything he later wrote. He had discovered, early and at first hand, that the arrangements of the world are not made for the convenience of people without money. He had wanted something and been told he could not have it because of what he was worth. That lesson, learned young, does not usually stay confined to the matter that taught it. And there is a third thing, which is simply that he arrived in London already knowing what grief and helplessness look like from the inside. To a physician who has never been on the other side of it, it can be perfectly competent and still be no comfort at all. Every account of Culpeper's practice, hostile and friendly alike, agrees on one point, which is that people liked having him in the room. He explained things. He answered questions. He did not stand on his dignity, having very little of it to stand on. It seems reasonable to suppose that some of that came from the young man in Sussex, who had once needed a great deal of comfort and, by every account, received very little. We turn now to what waited for him there, and to the long years of the mortar and the pestle. London in the middle 1630s held something like 300,000 people, which made it the largest city in England by an enormous margin and one of the largest in Europe. It was crowded, loud, and filthy in a way that is difficult to hold in the mind now. Sewage ran in the kennels down the middle of the streets. Coal smoke sat over the roofs on still days and blackened the stone of the churches. The houses leaned inward across the narrow lanes until neighbours could shake hands from opposite upper windows. Carts jammed the thoroughfares. Church bells rang constantly and from every direction. For a young man arriving from a Sussex village of a few hundred souls, the assault of it must have been very considerable indeed. He came to be apprenticed, and apprenticeship in that century was not a light arrangement. It ran 7 years, sometimes 8. The boy was bound by a legal indenture to his master, lived in the master's house, ate at the master's table, and was subject to the master's authority in almost every particular. He could not marry. He could not trade on his own account. He could not, in principle, leave. In exchange, the master undertook to teach him the whole of the craft, and, at the end of the term, to see him presented for his freedom, which was the license to set up as a master himself. A fee was paid at the start, often a substantial one, and for a family of modest means that fee represented a genuine sacrifice. Culpeper's apprenticeship went wrong almost at once, and then went wrong again. The accounts tell it in outline. He was bound first to an apothecary, whose business failed, or whose conduct failed, depending on which version you read. and the fee that his mother had scraped together went with the man when he vanished. A second arrangement was made, and the second master died. By any measure this was a wretched start, and it left a young man in a strange city, bound to nobody, with the money gone, and no obvious way to replace it. He was rescued, in the end, by a third apothecary named Samuel Lidbetter, who had a shop in the neighbourhood of Threadneedle Street and Bishopsgate, and who took him on. It is worth noting what kind of arrangement this was. Culpeper by this point was in an irregular position, and he seems never to have completed the formal path to the freedom of the Society of Apothecaries. He worked in Lidbetter's shop, learned the trade thoroughly, and increasingly practiced on his own account. But he did so without the license that made all of it tidy. That irregularity would follow him for the rest of his life. It is also, one suspects, part of why he ended up thinking the way he did about licenses. Let us turn now to the shop itself, and to what a young man in that position actually did with his days. An apothecary's shop of the 1630s was a dark, aromatic, extremely busy room. Along the walls stood shelves of drug jars, the tall lidded ones called albarelli for dry goods, and the squat gallipots for ointments and conserves, each with the name of its contents painted or lettered on the front, very often in Latin and very often abbreviated. Behind the counter hung the bunches of dried herbs, tied and inverted, replaced through the year as each came into season. There would be a great mortar of bell metal standing on the floor, or on its own low block, heavy enough that it could not be shifted by one man, and smaller mortars of marble and brass on the bench. There would be a pill tile of smooth slate or marble, a set of scales with their brass weights in a fitted box, a spatula, a strainer, a press. In the back room or the yard there would be a still, and a fire, and a great deal of patient waiting. The apprentice's day began early, and began with the unglamorous half of it. Fires to be lit, water to be fetched, the shop to be swept, and the counter wiped. Then the pounding. An enormous proportion of an apothecary's work in that century was simply the reduction of hard things into fine powder by main force, and the arm that did it belonged to the youngest person in the building. Roots, barks, seeds, dried gums, minerals. Hours of it. Anyone who has ever ground a spoonful of dried root by hand will have some idea of what a pound of it involves. Then the herbs. Fresh material came in from the country in baskets and had to be sorted, cleaned, picked over, stripped from the stalk, and either used at once or tied and hung to dry in the loft. Dried stock had to be checked for damp and mold and turned. Seeds had to be winnowed. Roots had to be washed, sliced and spread. Then the preparations, which is where the craft actually lay. Infusions, made by pouring hot water over a herb and letting it stand. Decoctions, made by simmering the harder parts, the roots and barks, for a long time over a low fire. Syrups, made by boiling those liquids with sugar or honey until they held. Conserves, which were fresh flowers or leaves beaten to a paste with sugar and kept in a jar. Oils, made by steeping herbs in olive oil in the sun for weeks. Ointments and salves, made by working those oils with wax and fat. Plasters, spread on leather or linen. Electuaries, which were medicines worked into a thick sweet paste, and boluses, which were single doses of the same rolled into a lump. Pills, rolled by hand on the tile and dusted, so they would not stick. Distilled waters, drawn off from the still drop by drop while somebody watched the fire. And then the great compound medicines, which were the pride and the burden of the trade. Theriac, known in London as Venice treacle, was the most famous of them, a confection of some 60 or 70 ingredients, including opium and the flesh of vipers, prepared over weeks and matured for years, held to be a remedy against poisons and plague, and very nearly everything else. Mithridate was its slightly less elaborate cousin. Both were expensive, both were prestigious, and both required an apothecary to keep on hand a shelf of costly imported ingredients that arrived in London by way of the Levant and the Indies. Let us turn now to those imported ingredients, because a young man was quietly forming an opinion about them. The drug jars of a good London shop held a remarkable geography. Senna from Egypt, rhubarb root, the true kind, carried overland from far inland in Asia and worth a great deal by the time it reached Bishopsgate. Scammony from the eastern Mediterranean, opium, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg and mace from the East Indies, myrrh and frankincense from Arabia, aloes, dragon's blood, which was a red resin, bezoar stones taken from the stomachs of goats and sold for extraordinary sums as an antidote to poison, powdered pearl, coral, gold leaf, actually swallowed, mummy, which was exactly what the name suggests, and which had a settled place in the Pharmacopoeia, unicorn's horn, which was generally the tusk of a narwhal, and which was priced accordingly. Some of these were genuinely effective medicines, and a few of them are still with us in one form or another. Many of them were not. What all of them had in common was that they were expensive, that they had to be bought from a merchant, and that a poor patient could not afford them under any circumstances. Meanwhile, in the baskets that came in from the country, and in the loft where they hung drying, were nettle and plantain and yarrow and elder and comfrey and betony, which grew within a mile of almost every door in England and cost nothing at all. He noticed. It is not hard to see him noticing. Let us turn now to the piece of paper that passed across that counter every day, and to the language it was written in. The system worked like this. A physician licensed by the college examined a patient and wrote a prescription. The apothecary read the prescription and made up what it specified. The physician was forbidden to keep a shop and sell medicines. The apothecary was forbidden to diagnose and prescribe. The line between them was defended fiercely from the physician's side and crossed constantly from the apothecary's side, because the apothecary was in the street, was cheap, was there when the physician was not, and had a very good working knowledge of what to give for an ordinary complaint, and the prescription was written in Latin, all of it. The names of the ingredients, the quantities, the instructions for preparing it, the directions for taking it. A patient handing that paper across the counter had no idea what was on it. They could not know what they were about to swallow, what it had cost to make, or whether the apothecary had given them what the physician ordered. They could only pay. Culpeper stood on the other side of that counter for years, watching people hand over money for words they could not read. Whatever else went into the making of him, that did. There is a small piece of documentary evidence from the end of this period that puts the situation very neatly. The College of Physicians took an interest in Samuel Lidbetter's shop, and specifically in the unlicensed young man working there and seeing patients on his own account, and Leadbetter was leaned on to be rid of him. The pressure worked, at least on paper. The young man went elsewhere. Let us stay a moment longer in that shop, because there is a detail of the trade that explains a great deal about the man he became. An apothecary was, whatever the college preferred to think, the closest thing to a doctor that most of London ever saw. He stood behind a counter in a public street, in a district where he was known, and people came to him with their troubles because he was there and because he was cheap. He heard them out standing up, between other customers, with the shop door open. He gave what advice he could, and made up what he thought would serve, and he did it 50 or 80 times a day. That is a completely different relationship from the one a licensed physician had with a patient. The physician was sent for. He arrived at a house, was received, sat down, took his time, took his fee, and left. He saw perhaps a handful of people in a day, and every one of them could afford him. The apothecary saw the whole street. An education of that kind teaches things a university cannot. It teaches what the common complaints actually are, in their real proportions, which is not at all the same as their proportions in a textbook. It teaches how people describe their own symptoms, which is badly and in the wrong order. It teaches which remedies people will actually take and which they will pour away when nobody is looking. And it teaches, week after week, exactly how much a family can afford and what happens when a remedy costs more than that. Years later, when he came to write his herbal, the plants he gave the most space to were not the rare and interesting ones. They were the ones a man behind a counter in a poor parish reaches for 40 times a week. We turn now to the year that changed his circumstances entirely, and to a woman named Alice. In the year 1640, Nicholas Culpeper married Alice Field. He was 23. She was about 15, which startles a modern ear, but was within the ordinary range for a marriage of that kind in that century, particularly where property was involved. Her family were merchants, and she brought with her a substantial inheritance, a sum large enough to change the whole shape of his prospects in a single afternoon. Almost nothing is known of her directly, which is the usual fate of women in these stories, and it is worth saying plainly rather than glossing over. We know she married him. We know she bore him 7 children. We know she outlived him. And we know that after his death, she took considerable trouble over his manuscripts and his reputation. Everything else is inference, but that last fact is not nothing. A widow who did not care would have let the papers go. With her money they left the crowded parishes inside the wall and moved out through Bishopsgate to Spitalfields and took a house in Red Lion Street. Let us turn now to that neighbourhood, because the choice of it was not accidental. Spitalfields took its name from the fields that had once belonged to the priory and hospital of St. Mary Spetal, dissolved a century before. By the 1640s it was filling up fast, a district of small houses and workshops pressed against the eastern edge of the city, outside the wall and outside the city of London's jurisdiction, in the county of Middlesex. It was a weaving district. Silk weavers, many of them of Flemish and Walloon descent, worked at looms in the upper rooms where the light was best. It was poor. It was crowded. It had the character that districts just outside a city wall have always had, which is a certain freedom and a certain roughness in equal measure. The freedom was the point, The College of Physicians held its authority over the city and a circuit of 7 miles around it, and in practice the further from the college's own hall a man set up, the less likely anyone was to trouble him. The Society of Apothecaries governed the trade within the city. A man who had never taken his freedom could not comfortably open a shop on Bucklersbury among the established houses. In Spitalfields he could open whatever he liked, and did. The house had the shop at the front, a still room and working space behind, a drying loft above, and a garden. He planted the garden. He also walked out of it constantly, north and east into the fields at Hackney and Islington, and up towards Highgate, gathering his own material by the basketful, rather than buying it in from merchants, which was both a saving and a statement. And then the patients came. The figure that comes down to us is 40 in a morning, and while nobody can check it, it is the sort of number that fits everything else we know. He was cheap. Frequently he was free. He was in a parish with a great many people in it, and very little medical provision, and word travels fast in a crowded street. He would take a case, ask his questions, very often ask the hour at which the illness had first come on, so that he could cast a figure of the heavens for it, and then make up the remedy himself, from his own herbs, on the spot. It is worth dwelling for a moment on who those patients actually were, since the phrase "the poor of the parish" can slide past without leaving a picture. They were weavers, mostly, working narrow looms in upper rooms for a master who supplied the silk and took the cloth. Their wives and children wound and prepared the thread. There were dyers, whose trade needed water and stank enough that nobody wanted it inside the wall. Brewers, carters, porters and labourers who walked into the city every morning to find work and walked back at night. Soldiers' widows, servants between places, and a steady thread of incomers from the countryside and from across the sea, since a district outside the wall with cheap rooms and no guild to answer to has always been where new arrivals land. The illnesses that came through the door reflected all of that with complete accuracy. Chests ruined by dust and damp rooms, eyes ruined by close work in bad light, hands and backs worn out early, fevers running through crowded houses, children who did not thrive, skin complaints from bad water and no soap, injuries from heavy work, badly set and never quite right afterwards, and behind all of it the ordinary background of a poor 17th century parish, which was hunger of the slow kind, the sort that does not kill anybody directly and makes everything else worse. Against that, a bright infusion of chamomile is not very much. But it was something, and it was there, and it was free, and there was no alternative on offer. Somewhere in the early 1640s, he was accused, according to the old accounts, of witchcraft, and stood trial, and was acquitted. The record is thin, and modern historians handle it carefully. What is certain is that the combination he presented, an unlicensed man practicing medicine among the poor, casting horoscopes, arguing publicly with the learned, was exactly the combination that attracted that kind of accusation in that decade, and he seems to have known it. The children came too, and most of them did not stay. 7 were born to the household in Red Lion Street across the years, and only one, a daughter named Mary, outlived her father. That is a great deal of grief to carry through a working life, and it was not at all unusual for the century, and it does not stop being a great deal of grief for being usual. Picture the shop on an ordinary morning, because we will not get closer to him than this. A street of small houses and workshops, the looms already going overhead. A door open onto it. Inside the counter the jars, the smell of dried herbs and beeswax, and the sharper note of something simmering in the back. Bunches hanging from the beams, replaced through the year as the season brought each one in. A man in his late 20s, thin, coughing occasionally, working at the counter with his sleeves pushed back, and a queue of people waiting who have come from 3 or 4 streets away, because word has got round. A woman with a child on her hip, and a rash she cannot get rid of. An old weaver whose hands have stopped working properly. A girl sent by her mother with a description she has been told to repeat exactly and has half forgotten. Somebody's husband, coughing since Christmas, and each of them asked the same short set of questions, and asked one more that no other practitioner in London would have asked, which was what hour of what day the trouble first came on, so that a figure could be drawn for it. Then the answer, and the herb, made up there, and then from the shelf behind him, or from the drying loft above. And frequently no money changing hands at all. It is not a heroic scene. It is a repetitive, tiring, unglamorous one, repeated every morning for something like 14 years, and it is the actual substance of the man's life. The books are what survived. This is what he did. We turn now to the institution across the city that had already noticed him, and to the wall of Latin it had built around English medicine. The College of Physicians of London had been founded in the year 1518, under a charter from Henry VIII, at the urging of the humanist scholar and royal physician Thomas Linacre. Its stated purpose was a good one, and was very largely honest. In the England of that period, anybody at all could call himself a physician, and a great many people did, including some who were frankly dangerous. The college was established to examine those who wished to practice in London, to license the competent, and to suppress the rest. Its powers were real. It could examine, it could license, it could fine, and in certain circumstances it could imprison. It had authority over the practice of physic in the city of London and for 7 miles around it, which took in every place a Londoner was likely to live. It also had the right to inspect apothecaries' shops and to condemn and destroy any drugs it found there that it judged unfit, which gave it a standing lever over the entire trade. And it was very small. Across most of its first century and a half, the college consisted of a few dozen fellows. A body of that size, licensing physic for a city that had passed 300,000 people and was still growing, was never going to be able to supply the medical needs of that city, and it never claimed it could. It regulated the top of the market. Below the top of the market there were apothecaries, surgeons, bone setters, midwives, cunning women, herb sellers, and a great deal of household practice. And that was where almost everybody in London actually went when they were ill. Let us turn now to the apothecaries, and to the line drawn between them and the physicians. The apothecaries had been part of the grocer's company, which is to say, they had been classed with the general trade in imported goods, spices and sugars, and drugs together. In 1617 they were granted their own charter by James I and became the Society of Apothecaries, a separate body with its own hall and its own apprenticeship. This was a significant elevation, and it was accompanied by a significant restriction. An apothecary was to compound and dispense. He was not to prescribe. He might sell you a remedy that a physician had ordered, and he might sell you the ordinary simple things over the counter, but he was not to examine you, decide what was wrong with you, and treat you accordingly. That was physic, and physic belonged to the college. In practice, the line was crossed every single day, in every shop in London, for the plainest of reasons. A physician's fee ran to something in the order of 10 shillings for a consultation, and a labourer earned in the region of a shilling a day. The arithmetic ends the argument. A weaver's wife with a sick child was not going to spend 10 days of her husband's wages on a consultation. She was going to walk to the apothecary on the corner, describe the trouble, and take away what he suggested for a few pence. Everyone involved understood this, including the college, which prosecuted when it was provoked, and otherwise let a great deal pass. Let us turn now to the book at the centre of the quarrel. In 1618, the College of Physicians published the Pharmacopoeia Londinensis, the London Dispensatory. It was the first official pharmacopoeia for the city, produced under royal proclamation, and its purpose was standardization. Before it, an apothecary made up a compound medicine according to whichever recipe he had learned or inherited, and the same named remedy might differ considerably from one shop to the next. The Pharmacopoeia fixed the recipes. Every apothecary in London was required to compound according to it, and the college's inspectors could check. The book itself was organized in the way such books were. First the simples, the single substances, the plants and minerals and animal products, listed with their qualities. Then the compounds, arranged by kind, syrups, distilled waters, spirits, decoctions, oils, ointments, plasters, pills, troches, which were little dried lozenges, electuaries and confections, for each the ingredients, the proportions, and the method. It was, in its own terms, a genuinely useful piece of work, and it went through revisions, a substantial one appearing in 1650, and it was written entirely in Latin. Let us sit with that for a moment, because it is the whole hinge of the evening. Latin in the 17th century was the language of the learned across the whole of Europe, and there were perfectly respectable reasons for a technical book to use it. It was international. A physician in Padua could read a book printed in London. It was precise, with an established vocabulary that had been refined over centuries. Publishing in Latin was simply what one did with serious work, but it had a second effect, whether or not anybody intended it, and the second effect was this. The Pharmacopoeia described every medicine legally available in London. The prescriptions written from it were in Latin. The jars in the shops were labelled in Latin, and so the entire content of English medicine, what was in it, what it cost to make, what it was supposed to do, sat behind a language that perhaps 2 or 3 men in 100 could read, and none of the women. The college's defense of this was sincere, and is worth stating fairly, because Culpeper's opponents were not villains, and it does the story no good to pretend they were. Their position was that these were dangerous substances, that opium and hellebore and scammony and antimony and mercury in the hands of people who did not understand degrees and doses and constitutions would kill. That the difference between a medicine and a poison is very often only a quantity. that the half-educated man treating himself out of a cheap book is a danger to himself and to his family, and that the profession had a duty to prevent it. There is something in that. There is always something in that, and it is the argument that every professional body has made in every century since. Culpeper's answer was not that the danger was imaginary. His answer was that the choice being described did not exist. The poor of Spitalfields were not choosing between a licensed physician and a cheap book. They were choosing between a cheap book and nothing whatever, because no licensed physician was ever going to walk down Red Lion Street, and no family in it could have paid him if he had. And he had a further point, which he made repeatedly and with some bitterness. In plague time, when the sickness came into the city and the need was greatest, a good many of the licensed physicians left London for the country, as men of means did, and the people who stayed with the dying were the apothecaries, the parish nurses, the searchers, and the women of the streets themselves. Let us turn now to the accident of history that made his book possible. None of what he did next could have been done 10 years earlier. Printing in England had been controlled, since the previous century, by a licensing system, with the Stationers' Company holding the register, and the Court of Star Chamber standing behind it with real teeth. Nothing was to be printed without approval. Approval was not going to be given to an English translation of the college's own book. In 1641, the Long Parliament abolished the Star Chamber, and the machinery of censorship went with it. What followed was one of the great outpourings of cheap print in English history. Pamphlets, newsbooks, sermons, political tracts, prophecies, satires, all of it pouring off small presses in enormous quantity and selling for pennies in the street. Ideas that had circulated quietly in manuscript for decades now appeared in print, because there was nothing left to stop them. An apothecary in Spitalfields with a grievance, a good Latin education, and access to a sympathetic printer was, in that particular decade, and in no other, in a position to do something about it. There is one more piece of the picture worth setting down before we go to the book, and it concerns what the college's authority actually felt like on the ground. For the great majority of unlicensed practitioners in London, it felt like nothing at all, because nothing at all happened to them. There were far too many, spread over far too wide a city, and the college had neither the officers nor the appetite to pursue them. What it pursued were the visible cases. The man who advertised, the man who took a wealthy patient away from a fellow of the college, the man who published, the man who made himself a nuisance. Culpeper was going to be all for. It is also worth saying, because it is genuinely part of the story, that the college was not an entirely comfortable or united body in these years. It had lost its royal patron. It had members on both sides of a civil war. Its hall and its authority had both been shaken by a decade of upheaval. When it turned on an apothecary in Spitalfields with a printing press behind him, it was not acting from a position of serene institutional strength. It was, in some measure, a threatened body responding to a threat, and that is nearly always when institutions behave least well. None of which changes the substance of the quarrel. But it does explain why the response, when it came in the form of printed abuse in a newsbook, rather than a summons, a fine and a quiet end to the matter. They were not able to make it a quiet matter, and they may have known it. We turn now to the year 1649, and to the book that made his name and his enemies together. It appeared under the title A Physical Directory, and it announced itself plainly as a translation of the London Dispensatory made by the College of Physicians. It was printed for Peter Cole, whose shop stood at the sign of the printing press in Cornhill near the Royal Exchange, and Cole would remain his publisher and, so far as one can tell, his ally for the rest of his life. The core of it was exactly what it claimed. The college's Latin rendered into English. Every symbol, every compound, every recipe, every proportion. Set down in the language that people in London actually spoke. But Culpeper did not stop at translating, and this is what turned an irritation into an offense. He annotated it. Throughout the book he added his own commentary, in his own voice, and the commentary is where he told the reader what he actually thought. He gave the English country names of the plants alongside the Latin, so that a reader could go outside and find them. He explained how the preparations were made, in enough detail that a household could make them at its own fire, which removed the apothecary from the transaction as thoroughly as the translation had removed the physician. He marked out remedies he considered useless, and he said why. He was blunt about the expensive exotic ingredients, the powdered pearl and the gold and the bezoar, and blunter still about the ones he considered simply absurd. And he pointed out, again and again, when a costly compound of 30 ingredients could be replaced by a common herb from an English hedge. The reaction was immediate, and it was public, and it was not, on the whole, medical. It came in print, in the news books, and the tone of it was mockery rather than argument. He was written of as a drunkard. It was said, in words to that effect, that he had spent 2 years in a haze mangling the apothecary's book into nonsense, and the same attack reached back to accuse him of irreligion in a manner intended to be damaging in a year when such accusations still carried weight. It should be said clearly that the sharpest of these attacks came from the royalist press, and that the politics of the moment were doing at least as much work as the medicine. The year was 1649. The king had been executed in January. Culpeper had fought for Parliament. The college was, in its sympathies, largely on the other side. A pamphlet attacking him was scoring several points at once. He replied, at length, in prefaces to later editions, and he gave as good as he got, and there is no purpose in following that exchange very far tonight. It was a quarrel of its time, and it has the flavor of its time, which is to say it was intemperate on both sides. What he did with the later editions is more interesting than the quarrel, and it shows what he was actually after. He kept adding. The second edition of 1650 carried more commentary than the first, the third in 1653, more again. And by then, he had folded in a good deal of instruction that had nothing to do with the original Latin at all. How to know a good drug from a bad one on the shelf. How to judge whether a herb had been properly dried. What might be used in place of an ingredient a household could not obtain. Which of the vastly expensive compounds could be left alone entirely, and what a poor person might use instead. In other words, having translated the professional's book, he set about turning it into a manual for people who were not professionals, one edition at a time. The translation was the door. What followed was him standing in the doorway, explaining the room. He also, in those prefaces, made the argument straightforwardly, and it is worth stating in the calm form he sometimes managed rather than the furious form he sometimes preferred. Knowledge kept in a language is not thereby made safe. It is only made scarce, and scarcity in medicine does not fall on everybody equally. It falls on the people who cannot buy their way past it. The part that matters is quieter. The book sold. It sold well enough that a second edition followed in 1650, enlarged with more commentary. Well enough that a third followed in 1653, larger still, now simply called the London Dispensatory. Well enough that the man who had been mocked as a drunk hack was, within 2 years, one of the most widely read medical writers in England. And nothing could be done about it. The college's powers were over practitioners, not over printers. It could fine an unlicensed man for treating patients. It could not stop a bookseller in Cornhill from selling a book, and in the England of 1649, there was no longer anybody that could. Let us sit for a moment with what the translation actually did, because it is easy to state and easy to underestimate. Before 1649, if you were an English man or woman who could not read Latin, and you were ill, and you went to a physician, this is what happened. You described your trouble. He considered it in terms drawn from a body of theory you had never been taught and could not evaluate. He wrote something down in a language you could not read and handed it to you. You carried it to an apothecary who read it and who made up something out of jars labeled in the same language. You paid for it. You swallowed it. At no point in the entire transaction did you have any means of knowing what you had been given, why, at what cost, or whether it was what had been ordered. After 1649, if you owned a copy of a certain cheap book, you could take that piece of paper home and look up every word on it. That is the whole revolution, and it is not a medical revolution at all. The medicine was exactly the same medicine, no better and no worse than it had been the year before. What changed was who was allowed to understand it. He shifted a body of knowledge from one side of a language barrier to the other, and everything downstream of that followed on its own. Anyone who has watched a similar thing happen since, in law, in finance, in any trade that keeps a private vocabulary, will recognize the pattern of the response as well. The objection was never that the translation was inaccurate. The objection was that it had been made. We turn now to something that happened 6 years before all of this, on a field in Berkshire on a September afternoon, and to the wound that was quietly killing him the whole time he wrote. The war came in the summer of 1642, and London was never in much doubt about which side it was on. The trades were for Parliament. The apprentices were for Parliament, loudly. The eastern parishes outside the wall, the weaving districts, the poor crowded streets where Culpeper had his shop, were for Parliament almost to a man. In the autumn of that year the city dug earthworks around itself, and the digging was done by householders and apprentices and women in their thousands, working in shifts. The city's own soldiers were the trained bands, the London militia, organized by regiment and distinguished by color: red, white, yellow, blue, green, orange. They were part-time men, shopkeepers and craftsmen and journeymen, who mustered for drill, and on paper they were exactly the sort of amateur force that a professional army ought to be able to brush aside. In practice, the London regiments turned out to be among the steadiest infantry that Parliament possessed, and everyone who fought against them learned it. Culpeper went with them. He served as a field surgeon, which is to say he went where the wounded were, with a chest of instruments and a bag of dressings, and did what could be done. Let us turn now to what that work actually involved, and let us do it gently, because there is no need to dwell on the worst of it tonight. A field surgeon of the 1640s carried a chest with a set of tools that would be recognizable in outline to a modern eye and alarming in almost every detail. Probes for finding a musket ball, long forceps for drawing it out, a tourniquet, knives and a saw for amputation. Cauteries, though the best men of the period used them far less than their predecessors had. Needles and waxed thread, splints and rollers of linen bandage, and a stock of dressings, salves and wound drinks, which is the part that concerns us. The great change in wound treatment had come the previous century, from the French surgeon Ambroise Paré, and it had come by accident. The accepted practice for gunshot wounds had been to pour boiling oil into them, on the theory that gunpowder left a poison behind that had to be burned out. At a siege, Paré ran out of oil, improvised a dressing of egg yolk, oil of roses and turpentine, and found the next morning that the men treated with his improvisation were resting comfortably, while the men treated with boiling oil were in torment. He resolved, in a line that has been quoted ever since, never to burn wounded men so cruelly again. By Culpeper's day that lesson had largely been learned, and the dressings a field surgeon carried were gentler things. Salves and oils spread on lint, plasters, and the herbs that every English practitioner reached for when there was bleeding to stop and flesh to close. Yarrow was the first of them, and it had been the first of them since the classical world. Its old names say everything: soldier's woundwort, staunchweed, herb militaris. The bruised leaf packed into a cut was the standard field remedy for bleeding across the whole of Europe, and Culpeper would later write of it exactly in those terms. Self-heal, sometimes called carpenter's herb, went into wound drinks, which were infusions given internally in the belief that they would help a wound close from within. Bugle and sanicle went into the same drinks. Comfrey, the great knitbone, went on to broken limbs and bruised flesh. Plantain, the flat rosette that grows in every trodden path in England, was applied to cuts and stings and burns. St. John's wort, steeped in olive oil until the oil turns a deep red, made an ointment that was used on wounds and on nerve pain, and it is still made in exactly that way in country kitchens today. None of this could do anything at all about the real killer, which was not the wound, but what came after it. The vast majority of men who died of injuries in that war died days later, of fever and putrefaction, in a barn or a church or a requisitioned house. The germ theory was 2 centuries away. A surgeon of 1643 could stop bleeding, set a bone, draw a ball, and dress a wound cleanly, and he could do nothing whatever about infection except keep the dressings changed and hope. It is worth saying what the medical arrangements of that war actually were, since they were not good. Neither side had anything resembling a medical service in the modern sense. Each regiment was supposed to have a surgeon and a surgeon's mate, paid at a modest rate, equipped at their own expense or at the colonel's. There were no hospitals in the field. Wounded men were carried to whatever building was nearest, a barn, a church, a farmhouse, and laid on straw. There was no organized transport for them, and no organized feeding. After a battle, the local parish very often found itself with 100 wounded strangers to look after, and no means to do it. Both sides did eventually make arrangements in the towns, and Parliament in particular set up hospitals in London for the men brought back from the fighting, at the Savoy and at Ely House. But that was for the men who survived the journey, and a great many did not. What this meant for a man like Culpeper is that the work was largely improvised and largely unsupported. He would have carried what he could and used what he found, and it is worth remembering that a very great deal of what a surgeon needed in that situation was not surgical at all. It was clean cloth and water, and something to bring a fever down, and something to help a man sleep, and a person willing to sit down beside him and speak calmly for a while. Let us turn now to the 20th of September, 1643, and to a ridge of high ground west of the town of Newbury. The campaign that led there had begun with Gloucester. The city, held for Parliament, was under siege by the King's army and close to falling, and the Earl of Essex marched out of London to relieve it, taking the trained bands with him. The march west succeeded. Gloucester was relieved, and then the army had to get home, and the king moved to cut it off. And on the night of the 19th of September, the royal army placed itself squarely across the road, back to London at Newbury. The battle that followed the next day was fought over enclosed country, small hedged fields and lanes, which suited infantry and hampered cavalry. The London regiments found themselves on the high ground and were charged and charged again by the royalist horse through the course of a long day. They held. It is the thing they are remembered for. Amateur soldiers, shopkeepers and weavers, standing in formation on a Berkshire hillside under repeated cavalry attack and not breaking. Somewhere in that day, Nicholas Culpeper was shot in the chest. The accounts are brief about it, as such accounts usually are. A musket ball, the chest. He survived it, which given the state of thoracic surgery in 1643 is remarkable enough on its own. And he was brought home to London, and he recovered as far as he was ever going to recover, which was not entirely. Every account of his later years mentions the state of his health. He was never strong afterwards. He coughed. He tired. Whatever the ball had done to the tissue of his chest, it did not heal cleanly, and he compounded it steadily thereafter with tobacco, which he smoked heavily, as a great many men of his generation did, in the confident belief that it was medicinal. It is worth holding this in mind through everything that follows tonight. Every book he wrote, the translation and the quarrels and the great herbal itself, all of it was written afterwards by a man in his 30s with a damaged chest and a persistent cough, working long hours in a shop and seeing patients every morning, in the knowledge, one imagines, that he did not have unlimited time. There is one further thing the war gave him, and it is not the wound. An army surgeon in that period treated whoever was carried to him, and the men carried to him were overwhelmingly ordinary. Apprentices and labourers and journeymen out of the same streets he already worked in, only now lying in a barn in Berkshire with a hole in them. He had already spent years treating the poor of one parish. Now he treated them by the hundred, in the worst circumstances available, with almost nothing to work with. Field practice strips medicine down to what can actually be carried and actually be done. There is no time for a consultation. no fee to be negotiated, no elegance and no theory that does not immediately help. You have what is in the chest, what grows in the hedge at the edge of the field, and however many hours of daylight remain. The men who did that work came away from it with a permanent impatience for anything in medicine that was ornamental. It is not difficult to draw a line from that autumn to the book he wrote 9 years later. A herbal built entirely out of plants that grow within walking distance of the reader, priced so that anybody can own it, describing preparations that can be made at an ordinary fire with an ordinary pot, is a field surgeon's book as much as it is an apothecary's. And it is a book written by a man who had watched a great many ordinary people die for want of very simple things. We turn now to the book he made in those years, and to the quiet, careful method he used to build it. The English Physician appeared in 1652. The following year it came back as the English Physician Enlarged, and in that form it held something in the order of 360 plants, which is the version that has come down through the centuries as the Complete Herbal. Every one of those entries is built the same way, in 4 movements, and once you notice the pattern, you cannot stop noticing it. The first movement is the description. He tells you what the plant looks like at length, and with a patience that can seem excessive until you understand who he is writing for. The height it reaches, the color and shape of the leaf, and whether it is smooth or rough, and what the underside is like. The way the leaves are set on the stalk, the color of the flower and the arrangement of its petals, the seed, the root, and whether it is a single tap or a tangle of fibers, and what color it is when you cut it. He will tell you the smell. He will tell you the taste, bitter or sharp or sweetish, or nothing much at all. Where a plant has several near relatives that might be confused with it, he takes them one at a time. The second movement is the place, where in England this grows, wet ground or dry, shade or sun, hedgerows or waste places or gardens only. He is specific in the way a person is specific when they have actually been out looking. Ditches, old walls, the borders of fields, sandy ground near the sea, under the shade of trees in woods and copses. The third movement is the time, what month it comes up, when it flowers, when the seed ripens, when the root is at its best for digging. This is not decoration. If you are going to gather your own medicine, the calendar is half the craft, and he knew that his reader had no one else to tell them. And the fourth movement is the one he called Government and Virtues, which opens by naming the planet that rules the plant, and then gives you everything the plant was held to do, and how to prepare it, and in what quantity, and what to be careful of. Let us turn now to what he was building on, because he did not invent the English herbal and never claimed to. There was a considerable tradition behind him. William Turner, a century earlier, had produced the first serious herbal in English, and is generally called the father of English botany for it. John Gerard's herbal of 1597 was the famous one, a great folio full of woodcuts, corrected and much improved in 1633 by the apothecary Thomas Johnson. John Parkinson had published a delightful book on garden plants in 1629, and then in 1640, the Theatrum Botanicum, a vast work describing something approaching 1,700 plants, which was the largest herbal ever printed in English. Culpeper knew these books. He used them. He says so. What he did with them was subtraction. Those were folios. They were heavy, they were expensive, they stood on library tables, and they described the plants of the world. His book was small enough for a pocket, cheap enough for a labourer, and it described, as his own title page said, the common herbs of this nation. He cut out the exotics almost entirely. If it did not grow in England, or could not be grown in an English garden, it very largely did not appear. This was a principle rather than a limitation. He held that a country's own soil produced the remedies for that country's own diseases, and while no modern pharmacologist would defend that as stated, as a piece of practical advice to a poor reader, it was very sound indeed. It kept the whole book inside the reach of somebody with no money. He also added his own eyes. Not everything in the descriptions comes from Gerard and Parkinson. There are details in Culpeper that read as though written by a man who had knelt down in a lane with the plant in his hand. And there are corrections where he had looked and found the older books wrong, and he added his voice, which is the thing no folio had. He addresses the reader directly. He tells you when a remedy is one he has used himself and found good. He tells you when he doubts something. Occasionally he admits that he does not know, which was not a common posture in 17th century medical writing. He gives substitutes, so that a reader who cannot find one herb is told what else will serve. He gives cautions plainly about the plants that will harm you. And every so often he stops the botany altogether and argues, for a page or more, about physicians and fees and Latin and the state of the world, and then returns to the description of a leaf, as though nothing had happened, a word about how such a book was actually assembled, since it is a thing rarely described and rather pleasant to imagine. There was no card index and no filing system. A writer of that period worked with a commonplace book, or several, into which everything of interest was copied as it was encountered, under headings, in his own hand, passages out of Gerard and Parkinson and the classical authorities, notes of his own observation, cases from the shop, remedies heard from other practitioners or from patients. Over years, these accumulate into an enormous personal accumulation of material, disorderly and thoroughly known to its owner and to nobody else on earth. Out of that heap the book is written, plant by plant, in longhand, with a quill that has to be cut and recut and an inkpot that has to be watched. 360 entries, each with 4 sections, each requiring the writer to hold in his head everything he has ever read or seen about that one plant and choose what to keep. It is slow work, and it was done in the evenings and the gaps of a working life, in a house where a shop was operating downstairs and children were being born and buried upstairs. Then the sheets go to Peter Cole in Cornhill and are set in type letter by a compositor who has to read the author's hand, and pulled on a wooden press one sheet at a time, and folded and gathered and stitched and stacked in a bookshop by the Royal Exchange to be sold for 3 pence. We turn now to the strangest and most beautiful part of the whole book, and to the 7 wandering lights that he believed governed every growing thing in England. To understand what Culpeper meant by the government of a plant, we have to put the modern sky away for a while and stand under the old one instead. It is not a difficult sky to imagine. In many ways it is a more comfortable one. The earth stands still at the center. Around it turn a series of crystalline spheres, one inside the next, and fixed in those spheres are the 7 wandering lights. Nearest to us and quickest, the moon, then Mercury, then Venus, then the Sun in the middle of the 7, then Mars, then Jupiter, and furthest out and slowest of all, Saturn, taking nearly 30 years to complete a single circuit. Beyond Saturn, the fixed stars, and beyond them whatever a person's theology preferred. Those 7 were held to govern the world below them, not to influence it vaguely, but to govern it in the way a magistrate governs a district, with a defined territory and defined responsibilities. Each ruled a metal. Gold belonged to the sun and silver to the moon, which anyone can see the sense of. Iron to Mars, copper to Venus, tin to Jupiter, lead to Saturn, and quicksilver to Mercury, which is why we still call that metal Mercury today. Each ruled a day of the week. And this one is hiding in plain sight in the language. Sunday and Monday give themselves away at once. Saturday is Saturn's day. The other 4 came into English through the northern gods who had been matched to the Roman ones, so that Mars became 2, Mercury became Woden, Jupiter became Thor, and Venus became Frigg, and we say their names every week without noticing. Each ruled a set of hours, cycling in a fixed order through the day and the night. Each ruled a portion of the body. The sun governed the heart and the vital spirit and the eyes. The moon governed the brain, the stomach, the womb, and all the fluids of the body. Mercury governed the brain also, and the tongue, the lungs and the nerves, everything to do with quickness and communication. Venus governed the kidneys, the throat and the generative parts. And Mars governed the gall, the muscles and the hot blood. Jupiter governed the liver and the lungs and the arteries. Saturn governed the spleen, the bones, the teeth and the skin, all the dry, slow, hard and enduring parts. The 12 signs of the zodiac had their own share of the body, running from head to foot in order. Aries the head, Taurus the neck and throat, Gemini the arms and shoulders, Cancer the breast and stomach, Leo the heart and back, Virgo the bowels, Libra the loins and kidneys, Scorpio the secret parts, Sagittarius the thighs, Capricorn the knees, Aquarius the legs and Pisces the feet. Almost every almanac printed in England in that century carried a woodcut of a man standing with the 12 creatures arranged down his body, and almost every household that could afford an almanac had seen it, and each planet ruled plants. Let us turn now to how a herbalist decided which plant belonged to which. There was no register to consult. The rulership of a herb was arrived at by reading the plant itself, and the reasoning ran along lines that are, once you have the trick of them, surprisingly consistent. Plants that were hot, sharp, biting, prickly or red, that stung the tongue or the hand, that grew armed with thorns or that flourished in rough places, were given to Mars. Nettle, garlic, hawthorn, wormwood, plants that were cool, moist, soft, watery pale, that grew in or beside water, that soothed and quieted and cooled a fever, were given to the moon. Water lily, chickweed, purslane, lettuce, plants that were beautiful, sweetly scented, kindly, that pleased the eye and the nose and did good gently, were given to Venus. Rose, primrose, violet, mint, yarrow, plants with fine, divided, airy leaves and aromatic seeds, quick growing, that helped the wind pass and the mind clear, were given to Mercury. Fennel, dill, caraway, marjoram, lavender, plants that were large, generous, temperate, that helped the liver and the blood, and did nothing to excess, were given to Jupiter. Sage, betony, borage, dandelion. Plants that were cold, dark, bitter, tough or slow, that grew in shade and on old walls and in graveyards, that lasted long and moved little, and above all those that were dangerous, were given to Saturn. Comfrey, horsetail, nightshade, hemlock, and plants with a bright open radiating flower, especially a yellow or golden one, that comforted the heart and lifted the spirits and turned their faces to the light, were given to the sun. Marigold, chamomile, St. John's wort, rosemary. You will notice that this is not arbitrary. It is a classification by sensory character. A person who has learned it can pick up an unfamiliar plant, note that it is hot and sharp and prickly, and place it in the system correctly without ever having been told. That is a considerable achievement for a scheme with no chemistry behind it whatever. Let us turn now to how the scheme was used in treatment, because there were two ways, and Culpeper explains both. The first way was sympathy. If an organ was weak, you strengthened it with herbs belonging to the planet that governed it. A failing liver, ruled by Jupiter, was fed with herbs of Jupiter. A weak heart, ruled by the sun, was comforted with herbs of the sun. The logic here is one of nourishment, like feeds like. The second way was antipathy, and it is the more interesting of the two. The planets stood in fixed opposition to one another. Mars against Venus, Saturn against the Sun and the Moon, Jupiter against Mercury. If a disease was caused by an excess of one planet, you drove it out with the herbs of its opposite. A hot inflamed swelling was a disease of Mars, and you brought it down with a cooling herb of Venus. A heavy melancholy was a disease of Saturn, and you lifted it with a cheerful herb of the Sun. Culpeper is quite explicit about this, and he repeats the principle throughout the herbal so that the reader will learn it by exposure. When he comes to plantain, that flat, unremarkable rosette in every trodden footpath, he tells you it is a herb of Venus and that it cures the diseases of the head by antipathy to Mars. And having said it once, he will say it again in different words 50 pages later. He was teaching a system, not just listing plants. He was also perfectly serious about it. He wrote elsewhere that a physician who worked without astrology was like a man attempting to work by a lamp with no oil in it. And he meant it as a plain professional judgment rather than a flourish. In 1651, he published a whole book on the astrological judgment of disease, built around the practice of the decumbiture, which meant casting a figure of the heavens for the exact hour a patient took to their bed. From that figure a practitioner read the nature of the illness, the organ affected, the likely course, and the remedy. Let us be plain about how to hold all this, because it would be dishonest to be either sneering or credulous about it tonight. None of it is pharmacology. The planets do not govern plants. Rosemary does not work because it belongs to the sun. Where his remedies did good, and a fair number of them did, they did good for reasons of chemistry that nobody in his century had any way of reaching. And where the planetary reasoning pointed him wrong, it pointed him wrong with complete confidence. But it did something else that was genuinely useful, and this is easy to miss. It was a memory system. 360 plants is a great many things for an unlettered reader to hold in their head, and a bare list is almost impossible to retain. Sorted into 7 households, each with a temperament, a color, a set of ailments, and a family resemblance running through it, the same 360 plants become learnable. You do not have to memorize that yarrow is good for wounds and mint for the stomach and violet for a cough. You learn the character of Venus, and the plants fall into place around it. Alongside the planets he used, more sparingly, another old scheme called the doctrine of signatures, which held that a plant carried a visible sign of what it was good for. The walnut, in its wrinkled shell resembling a brain, and therefore good for the head. Lungwort with its pale, spotted leaf resembling a diseased lung, and therefore good for the chest. Eyebright with a small dark center in its white flower, like a tiny eye. Saxifrage, whose roots break through stone, and therefore good against the stone in the bladder. It is charming and it is entirely wrong, and it too worked as a way of remembering. It should also be said, plainly, that in holding these views he was not an eccentric. He was mainstream. Astrology in England in the 1640s and 50s was at the height of its public standing. William Lilly, the most famous astrologer of the age, published a great treatise on the subject in English in 1647, and was consulted by members of Parliament and by the general public alike in enormous numbers. The almanacs that went into hundreds of thousands of English households every year were astrological documents from cover to cover. Physicians of the college used astrological reasoning without embarrassment. The medical doctrine of critical days, the belief that an illness turns for better or worse on particular days, counted from its onset, went back to Hippocrates himself and was taught everywhere, and it married very naturally to a system of planetary hours and aspects. What was unusual about Culpeper was not that he believed it. It was that he wrote it down in English for people who had never been given the chance to learn it, and that he combined it with a herbal, and that he sold the result for 3 pence. And there is a last observation to make before we go into the plants. The planetary system had one practical effect that is entirely separate from whether it was true. It gave a poor reader with no teacher a way to guess. Faced with an unfamiliar plant in a hedge, a person who had learned the 7 characters could handle it, smell it, taste a little of it, note where it was growing, and form a working opinion about what it was likely to do. That reasoning was often wrong. It was still a great deal better than having no way to think about the problem at all, which is what such a reader had before. We turn now, at last, into the herbal itself, and we will walk it the way he arranged it, household by household, beginning with the brightest. The sun ruled the heart, the eyes, and the spirits, and his solar herbs are the ones that comfort, cheer, and quicken. They are, with striking consistency, the yellow ones. Rosemary he gives to the sun, and he says the sun claims dominion over it. It was among the most used herbs in England. The flowering tops were made into a conserve with sugar, taken for a weak head and a poor memory, and the distilled water was in every stillroom. Burned on a shovel, the dry twigs perfumed a sick room, and sprigs of it were carried at funerals and weddings alike as the herb of remembrance. He recommends it for cold in the head, for a dull mind, for stiff joints when made into an oil, and for the ordinary business of waking a person up. Chamomile is his, and it is the gentlest thing in the whole book. The small daisy flower of the meadow and the trodden path, made into an infusion for a restless child, a sour stomach, a headache, warmed in a bag and pressed against an aching side. boiled into a bath. He notes what every household knew, that its virtue lies in easing rather than forcing, and that it will do very little harm, however generously it is measured. Marigold, which we now call calendula, he places under the sun in Leo, and it is one of the plants he clearly loved. The bright orange petals worked into a salve for wounds, cuts, burns, and chapped hands. The dried petals dropped into a broth to strengthen the heart, a weak infusion for an unsettled stomach. It flowers nearly the whole year in a mild season, which made it the most available medicine in a poor garden. St. John's wort is a solar plant beyond argument, since it comes into its full flower at midsummer, and the flowers are the color of the sun itself. Steeped in olive oil and left in the light, it turns the oil a deep blood red, which struck every herbalist who saw it as significant. That red oil was rubbed into wounds, bruises, burns, and the deep aches of the nerves, and the herb had, long before Culpeper, a settled reputation for lifting a heaviness of the mind. Angelica he gives to the sun in Leo, and calls it a herb of great virtue against infection. The thick, hollow stalks were candied with sugar as a sweetmeat and a tonic. The root, dried and powdered, was carried in plague time and chewed. He recommends it for a cold stomach, for the winds, and for a chest that will not clear. Eyebright is his solar herb for the eyes, small and white-flowered with a dark spot in its throat, and both the signature and the name announce the use. The distilled water was dropped into tired and reddened eyes, and the dried herb was powdered into a wine or an ale for the same purpose. He remarks, with some feeling, that if the herb were used as much as it deserved, the spectacle makers would have a great deal less work. Greater celandine, with its yellow flower and its startling orange sap, he places under the sun in Leo, and he is careful about it. The sap was dabbed on warts, and it was used for the eyes, and for a yellowed complexion. He gives it respect and a warning in the same breath, which is a thing he does often and does well. Rue he gives to the sun, the blue-green bitter shrub by the door, planted in cottage gardens the length of the country, taken against poisons and infection, applied to stings, and hung to keep sickness from a house. He is candid that it is strong stuff and not for everybody. And the bay tree, the laurel, he also gives to the sun, and he says of it, in one of his best lines, that neither witch nor devil, thunder nor lightning will hurt a man where a bay tree grows, and that he is confident the sun would not have it so if it were otherwise. The berries and the leaves went into oils for aching limbs and into remedies for the stomach and the chest. Let us turn now, and let the light cool, to the household of the moon. Where the sun's plants are hot, bright and quickening, the moon's are cold, moist, pale and quieting, and they are very often found in or beside water. The moon governed the brain, the stomach, the womb, and every fluid of the body, and her herbs were reached for when something needed calming, cooling, or drawing down. The white poppy is hers, and it is the strongest thing in her household by a long way. Its syrup was the standard remedy in every English shop for a cough that would not let a person sleep, and for pain, and for sleeplessness itself. Culpeper describes its use plainly, and describes its dangers plainly too, which was more than some of his contemporaries managed. The water lily is hers, floating on the still ponds of England, cold and moist in the 2nd degree by the old reckoning. The root and the flowers were made into a syrup and a conserve given for fevers, for heat of the blood, and to quiet an over-excited mind, and the same preparation was rubbed on the temples of a person who could not sleep. Chickweed is hers, that soft, pale, sprawling weed that fills every neglected corner of every garden in the country. Boiled and applied warm, it eased inflammations and swellings and hot sore places. Made into an ointment with lard, it went on to rashes and irritated skin. It cost nothing and grew everywhere, which is precisely the kind of remedy he was in the business of promoting. Cleavers, the sticky trailing herb that fastens itself to a sleeve as you pass, he gives to the moon. The spring juice was drunk as a cleansing drink after winter, and the herb was used for swellings and for the skin. Purslane, lettuce and cucumber are all of them lunar, all of them cooling, all of them recommended for a hot stomach, a fever, an inflammation of the eyes, and a body running too warm. Lettuce in particular had a long reputation as a quieter of the spirits, and a strong infusion of it was given at bedtime. The cabbage, which he calls colewort, belongs to the moon as well, and the leaves bruised or wilted at the fire and bound over a swelling or an inflamed breast were used in that way in English households well into living memory. The willow is hers, standing with its feet in the water, and here we come to one of the great quiet ironies of the whole book. He recommends the leaves and bark for fevers and for hot inflammations, cooling and binding, and he had no way of knowing that the bark contains the substance from which, 2 centuries later, aspirin would be derived. He was right, and he was right for reasons he could not possibly have reached, and that combination occurs more often in his pages than a modern reader expects. Adder's tongue, that curious little fern of old damp meadows, he places under the moon in Cancer, and it went into a green ointment for wounds. Moonwort, its close relative, carries the moon in its name, and carried in folklore an extravagant reputation, said to open locks and draw the shoes from horses' feet, which he mentions with visible amusement and no great confidence. 2 more belong to the sun before we leave that house. The juniper, whose blue-black berries were burned to sweeten the air of a sick room, and were given for the stomach and the water, and which he praises warmly as a counter to poison and infection. And the walnut, which he gives to the sun, and which brings with it the old doctrine of signatures, since the kernel in its wrinkled shell was thought to resemble a brain within a skull, and was therefore held to be good for the head. The green husks and the leaves had their own uses, and the oil was pressed for both cookery and medicine. There is a small practical detail worth adding about how these 2 households were gathered, since it shaped the working year of every still room in England. The solar herbs were taken in high summer and taken in the light. St. John's wort at midsummer, marigold at midday with its face fully open, rosemary and bay in dry warm weather, when the oils in the leaf are at their strongest. Anyone who has picked aromatic herbs on a hot still morning knows exactly what this is about. The scent comes off them in the hand. The lunar herbs were taken from wet places, in the cool of the day or the evening, and used fresh far more often than dried, because the cooling, watery quality that made them useful is precisely the quality that drying destroys. Chickweed, purslane, lettuce, water lily. These were the summer remedies of a household. Applied the same afternoon they were picked. and they are almost the only group of plants in the whole book that a family could not lay by for the winter. We turn now to the sweetest household of the seven, and to the plants he gave to Venus. Venus, in the old scheme, was the lesser fortune, the kindly planet, gentle where Jupiter was generous. She governed the kidneys and the loins, the throat, and the generative parts of the body. She governed beauty, sweetness, and everything that pleases without effort. And her herbs, in Culpeper's arrangement, are the ones an English person would most easily recognize, because they are the flowers of the hedge and the meadow and the cottage border. The pretty ones, the sweet-smelling ones, the ones a child picks. Plantain is hers, and it is the plainest plant in her whole household. A flat rosette of ribbed leaves pressed against the ground in every footpath, every yard, every gateway in England, so common that nobody looks at it. Culpeper thought a great deal of it. The bruised leaf laid on a cut, a graze, a sting or a burn, the juice for a hot inflammation, an infusion of the leaves for a running of the bowels and for sore places in the mouth. It is here that he sets out the antipathy rule most clearly, telling the reader that this herb of Venus cures the diseases of the head by opposition to Mars, and the diseases of the private parts by opposition to Saturn. Yarrow is hers, that feathery grey-green herb of the roadside with its flat white flower head, and its uses go back into the classical world. The old names are all soldiers' names: staunchweed, woundwort, herb militaris, the leaf packed into a wound to stop bleeding, an infusion drunk hot at the start of a fever to bring on a sweat. He also notes its old use for a headache, held to the nose, and its reputation as a herb that steadied the bowels. Self-heal, sometimes called carpenter's herb, is hers, low and purple, flowered in the short grass, and it is one of the plants he mentions with real affection. The name says everything about its reputation. It went into wound drinks, and into salves, and into gargles for a sore mouth and throat. He remarks that a man need not run to a surgeon for every small hurt, while this grows in the field beside him. Bugle and sanicle stand beside it in the same use. The two great wound herbs of the English woods, and there was an old country saying he repeats, that a man who has bugle and sanicle in his garden has no need of a surgeon at all. He does not entirely endorse the saying. He clearly enjoys it. Vervain is hers, and it carries more folklore than almost any other plant in the book. A thin, unremarkable, upright herb with small pale flowers, it had been sacred to the Romans, was gathered with ceremony by the Druids, according to the classical writers, and remained an ingredient in country charms into his own century. He gives it for the liver, for headaches, for the eyes and for old sores, and he mentions the charms without either endorsing them or entirely dismissing them. Mint is hers, spearmint above all, and it needs no introduction in any century. He gives it for a weak and windy stomach, for a queasiness, for a poor appetite, and he mentions its use in a bath for a person tired to the bone. He also passes on the old caution that it should not be given to a nursing mother, since it was held to dry the milk. Tansy is hers, bitter and strong and unmistakable. With its flat heads of yellow buttons, the young leaves were beaten into cakes and eaten at Easter, a custom that survived in parts of England for centuries, and the herb was used against worms in children and for the stomach. He gives it a good deal of praise, and as with all the strong herbs, a note of caution. Mugwort is hers, tall and grey, undecided by every roadside, and it belonged particularly to women. It was used for every complaint of the womb, taken as an infusion, and it was also laid in the shoes of travellers on long journeys in the belief that it would keep the feet from tiring, which is one of those beliefs that is almost certainly nonsense and almost certainly made people feel better. Motherwort he places under Venus in Leo, and here he writes one of the warmest passages in the whole herbal. He says there is no better herb to drive melancholy vapours from the heart, to strengthen it, and to make the mind cheerful. And he adds that it may well be called motherwort, since it makes mothers joyful and settles the womb. It was given in wine or ale, or made into a conserve with sugar. Lady's mantle is hers, with its pleated fan of a leaf that holds a bead of dew in its centre all morning, a detail that fascinated the old herbalists and gave the plant a place in early alchemy. Culpeper uses it for wounds, for a looseness of the bowels, and for the complaints of women, and he notes its binding, drying quality. Elder is hers, and it is the great hedge tree of English medicine. The flowers gathered in early summer, made into a cooling drink for fevers, a wash for the eyes, and an ointment. The berries gathered in autumn, boiled down with sugar into a dark syrup, and kept through the winter against coughs and colds. The bark and root in larger doses, purging, and to be handled respectfully. Almost every part of the tree had a use, and almost every English household made something from it. The violet, the primrose, and the cowslip he gives to Venus together, the three gentle flowers of the early year. Violet flowers made into a syrup for a cough and a sore chest, and into a conserve for children. Primrose leaves into an ointment for wounds. Cowslip flowers into a wine, and into a conserve given for the head, for a poor memory, and for sleeplessness. He notes dryly that the ladies of his time made a water of cowslips for the complexion, and thought rather more of that use than of any other. The damask rose is hers, and roses in his system are a small puzzle, he explains carefully. The red rose he assigns to Jupiter, the damask to Venus, the white to the moon, each with a slightly different working. Rose water, conserve of red roses, syrup of damask roses, oil of roses. These were among the most used preparations in every shop in England. Cooling, comforting, mildly binding or mildly opening depending on the kind, and pleasant enough that a patient would actually take them. Thyme is hers, small and creeping and sharply aromatic, and he gives it for the chest, for a cough, for the winds, and as a general strengthener. Wild thyme on a dry bank was gathered as readily as the garden kind. Ground ivy, which he calls alhoof, is hers, a low creeping herb with a scalloped leaf that carpets shady ground. Before hops became universal, it was the herb that flavoured and cleared English ale, which is where the name comes from, and it was used for coughs, for the chest, for old sores, and for a ringing in the ears. The daisy is hers, and he gives the smallest and most trodden flower in England a respectable page. The leaves bruised for bruises and swellings, an ointment for wounds, and a decoction for aches of the joints. Coltsfoot is hers, the odd plant that flowers on bare ground in early spring before its leaves appear at all. Its whole reputation is the chest. The dried leaves were smoked in a pipe for a cough and a shortness of breath, a use that survived in country districts into the 20th century, and the flowers were made into a syrup for the same purpose. Burdock is hers, great coarse-leaved and burred, and the root was used for cleansing drinks, for the skin, and for old sores, dug in autumn and dried. The wild strawberry is hers, and he loves it. The fruit cooling, the leaves binding for a looseness, the roots and leaves in a decoction for the mouth and the gums, and the distilled water simply pleasant, which for once seems recommendation enough. Periwinkle is hers, trailing dark and glossy over shady banks, used for cramps, for bleeding, and, according to a rather cheerful old country belief, that he passes along without comment, for keeping affection between a married couple. Feverfew is hers as well, and its name tells its use, as so many English plant names do. The small pale daisy flowers and the bitter yellow-green leaf, chewed fresh or made into a bitter tea, given for headaches above all, and for fevers, and for the complaints of women. It grew along the path in cottage garden after cottage garden, and it is one of the very few plants in the whole book whose old reputation modern research has taken seriously. The archangel, which is the dead nettle, is hers, that stingless impostor that grows among the real nettles with white or purple flowers, and he gives it for the complaints of women and for bruises and swellings, remarking with evident pleasure on the difference between a plant that looks fierce and a plant that is. Wall pennywort, which he calls kidneywort, is hers, that curious round fleshy leaf with a dimple in its middle that grows out of damp walls and rocks in the west of the country. Cooling, applied to inflamed places and to sore eyes, and given on the strength of its shape and its name together, for the kidneys and the stone. Wood sorrel is hers, the little three-leaved sharp-tasting plant of shady woodland floors, cooling, given in fevers and for a hot stomach, and made into a green sauce. There is a pattern worth noticing across this whole household. The herbs of Venus are, almost without exception, the safe ones. They are the plants you can give to a child, or take yourself in generous quantity, or apply to broken skin without much thought. Yarrow, plantain, self-heal, violet, primrose, elder, mint, daisy. In a book written for people with no teacher and no physician to consult when something goes wrong, that matters enormously, and the reader who learns the character of Venus first has learned the safest quarter of English herbal medicine before they have learned anything else. Let us turn now, and let the temperature rise, to the household of Mars. Mars was the lesser in fortune, the hot planet, red and violent, ruling iron and fire and the gall, the muscles and the hot blood. His plants are the ones that bite. If it stings the tongue, pricks the hand, burns the throat, or grows armed with thorns, it is a herb of Mars, and Culpeper places them with complete consistency. Wormwood is his, and wormwood is where the whole herbal briefly loses its head. Somewhere in the middle of a perfectly ordinary set of entries, Culpeper stops writing like a herbalist and begins writing like a prophet, delivering several pages on wormwood in a strange, oracular, argumentative voice, addressing the reader directly, defending the plant, defending astrology, and taking on his critics all at once. It is easily the oddest passage in the book. Generations of readers have found it baffling, and it is also unmistakably the sound of a man enjoying himself. Underneath the performance, the medicine is conventional enough. Wormwood is bitter and hot, and it was used for the stomach, for the liver, for worms, and as an ingredient in the bitter tonic drinks that every household made. The nettle is his, and nobody has ever needed the rulership explained. He gives the young shoots as a spring pottage, cleansing after a winter of salted food, and the seed and leaves for the chest and the lungs. He mentions, without much enthusiasm, the old practice of beating aching joints with fresh nettles to bring the blood up, which was widely done and which he clearly regards as a treatment of last resort. Garlic is his, and he calls it the countryman's treacle, meaning the poor man's version of the great expensive antidote of the apothecary's shop. He gives it for the chest and the lungs, against infection, against worms, and applied outwardly for stings and bites. He is honest about its one drawback, which he says will be apparent to anybody in the room. Onions and leeks stand with it, hot and sharp, given for the chest, for a cough, and roasted and applied to draw a boil, which was one of the commonest household treatments in England for centuries. Mustard is his, hot and quick, and the seed bruised and mixed into a paste was spread on cloth and laid on the chest for a deep cough or on an aching joint. He warns to take it off before it burns, which is the sort of practical note that tells you he had done it. Horseradish is his, fierce enough to bring tears from across a table, given for the chest and used as a poultice on cold aching places. Hops are his, and by his century they had become the standard bittering of English beer, after a long argument about whether they should be permitted at all. He gives them for the liver, for cleansing the blood, and for opening obstructions, and their later reputation as a quieter of sleep sits comfortably alongside. Hawthorn is his, thorned and hedging half the fields in the country. The flowers and the berries used for the heart and for the stone, and hedged about in folklore with a great many rules about when it might be cut and when it might be brought indoors. Barberry is his, thorny and sharply sour, its berries used for fevers, for heat, and for the yellowness of the skin that came with a bad liver. Thistles as a family he gives to Mars, and the blessed thistle above all, which he sets under Mars in Aries. It was one of the most trusted herbs of his century, taken for fevers, for the heart, for infections, and for what was then called the plague, and he gives it a full and enthusiastic entry. Broom and gorse are his, both of them tough, both of them of the poor dry commons, and both used chiefly for the kidneys and for dropsy, in decoctions taken with a good deal of care. Basil is his, and it produces the funniest entry in the whole herbal. Culpeper opens by saying that this is the herb over which all the authorities are at each other's throat, and then proceeds to catalogue the quarrel with visible relish. Some of the classical writers held it a fine thing, others held that it bred scorpions in the brain, and one apparently claimed that a basil leaf laid under a stone would turn into a scorpion within days. Having laid out the whole ridiculous argument, he declines to settle it, notes what it is actually used for, and moves on to the next plant. Tobacco he gives to Mars, and he treats it as a serious medicine, which it was universally held to be in his century. It was smoked for the chest, applied for wounds and for skin troubles, and prescribed with confidence by men who had no reason whatever to suspect otherwise. He smoked it heavily himself, and it is one of the places where the honest limits of his knowledge, and of everybody's knowledge in 1652, sit quietly on the page. The radish and the rocket are his, both of them sharp on the tongue, both given for the stomach and the water, and the radish for the stone. Madder is his, the dyer's plant with its red root, grown in fields for the cloth trade and used medicinally for obstructions and for the jaundice. Bryony is his, that vigorous climber that runs over hedges in the summer with its curling tendrils and its scarlet berries in autumn, and it is one of the plants where his warning is louder than his recommendation. It was used as a violent purge, and it was widely misused, and he says so. Crowfoot, which is the buttercup family, he gives to Mars, and he is blunt that these plants blister the skin, that country people use them for exactly that purpose, to raise a blister where a blister was wanted, and that they are otherwise to be left alone. And here, having walked both households, we can see the whole antipathy scheme working in practice, because Mars and Venus are the pair that Culpeper leans on most heavily. A hot, red, angry, inflamed complaint is a disease of Mars, and the answer is a cooling herb of Venus. Plantain on a sting, violet syrup on a hot, dry cough, elderflower water on inflamed eyes, wood sorrel in a fever. A cold, damp, sluggish, stagnant complaint is a disease of Venus in her weaker aspect, or of Saturn, and the answer is a hot, sharp herb of Mars. Mustard on a cold, aching joint, garlic in a stopped chest, horseradish, onion drawn on a boil. It is not chemistry, but as a rule of thumb for a reader with no other rule, hot for cold and cool, for hot is neither foolish nor unsafe, and it happens to line up surprisingly often with what those plants actually do. We turn now to the quick household of Mercury, and to the generous one of Jupiter, and to the seeds and roots that filled the winter shelf. Mercury was the quick planet, nearest the sun, never far from it in the sky and never still. He governed the brain and the tongue, the lungs, the nerves, and everything to do with movement, speech and understanding. His herbs are the light ones, fine divided leaves, hollow stems, aromatic seeds, quick growth, sharp clean scents. They are the herbs a cook reaches for, and they are, almost without exception, the ones given for wind, for a clouded head, and for a chest that will not clear. Fennel is his, and it is the type of the whole household. Tall, feathery, blue-green, with its flat heads of tiny yellow flowers, and its seeds that taste faintly of aniseed. The seed was chewed for the digestion, and simmered into a water given to infants for the colic, which is a use that has never gone away, and is still sold under the same name today. The root and the leaves went into broths for the stomach, and for what he calls the winds. He also gives it, following the old authorities, for the eyes, and he passes on the country observation that serpents were said to rub against it to clear their sight after shedding their skins, which he reports as a story rather than as a fact. Dill is his, and it stands beside fennel in almost every use, gentler and smaller. Dill water for a fretful baby, dill seed for the stomach, and the herb in a warm poultice for a swelling. Sweet marjoram is his, and it is one of the kindest small herbs in the book. He gives it for the head, for cold aching places, for a stopped nose and a heavy chest, made into an infusion or a powder or steeped in oil. He also mentions that a little of the powder taken as snuff will provoke a sneeze and clear the head, which was standard practice. Caraway is his, warm and comforting, the seeds baked into bread and cakes and eaten after a heavy meal to settle it, a custom that survived in English households for centuries. He gives the seed for the stomach and the winds and the root boiled as a food for weak digestions. Southernwood is his silvery and sharp-scented, sometimes called lad's love, hung among stored woolens against moth, used in small quantities against worms in children, and rubbed on the skin against biting insects on summer evenings. Lavender is his, and here he sets down what everyone in England already knew. The flowers dried and laid in linen. The distilled water for the head, for faintness, for the tremblings, a conserve for a heaviness of the spirits. He is measured about it, warning that the oil is far stronger than the herb, and should be used sparingly, which is sound advice in any century. Valerian is his, thick-rooted, and once dried, memorably unpleasant to the nose. He gives it for the head, for cramps, for the chest, and as a general quieter of the nerves and the mind. And the modern reputation of the root as a settler of sleep is a direct continuation of exactly this. Elecampane is his, a great tall coarse plant with a yellow ragged flower and a root as thick as a wrist. That root was candied with sugar into a sweetmeat, and the sweetmeat was a cough medicine. It was given for the chest, for a long-standing cough, for shortness of breath, and it was one of the commonest and most trusted remedies in the country for the deep winter cough that carried so many people off. Horehound is his, grey and woolly, and thoroughly bitter, and its use is a single word: cough. The infusion sweetened with honey, or boiled with sugar into the hard sticky sweets that were still sold in English shops in living memory under exactly this name. Parsley and its relation smallage are his, and he gives them for the kidneys and the water, and for opening obstructions, and he mentions the seed and the root as much as the familiar leaf. Pellitory of the wall is his, that soft weed that grows out of old brickwork and the foot of walls all over England. It was one of the standard remedies for the stone and for difficulty in passing water, made into a decoction and used outwardly on inflamed places. Licorice is his, and although the plant is southern in origin, it was grown in England by his day, most famously in Yorkshire. The root, boiled down, went into every cough syrup and lozenge in the country, and sweetened a great many bitter medicines besides. Honeysuckle is his, the woodbine of the hedges, and he gives the flowers for the chest, and the leaves in a gargle for a sore mouth and throat, while warning the reader off the berries entirely. Maidenhair, the delicate fern of shaded rock and old wells, is his, and it went into syrups for the chest under the name capillaire, which remained a fashionable drink long after anybody remembered what was in it. Let us turn now to the great house of Jupiter, the larger fortune, the temperate and generous planet. Jupiter governed the liver, the lungs and the arteries, and everything of increase, growth and generosity. His herbs are the substantial ones, big-leaved, wholesome, well-flavored, taken as much for strength as for cure, and used in larger quantity and for longer periods than the herbs of any other planet. If a plant did good slowly, steadily, without violence, and was safe enough to take every day, it was very likely to be his. Sage is his, and its reputation was enormous. There was a Latin tag in wide circulation asking why a man should die who has sage growing in his garden, and it was quoted often enough that Culpeper felt no need to explain it. He gives sage for the head and the memory, for a sore throat in a gargle, for the chest, and for the liver, and he notes that it strengthens the sinews. Sage ale and sage tea were ordinary household drinks. Wood betony he places under Jupiter in Aries, and no plant in the whole book carries more accumulated reputation. There was an old saying, which he repeats, that a man should sell his coat and buy betony. It was the standard remedy for the head, for headaches of every kind, for the nerves, for the digestion, for wounds, and for a great many other things besides, and it had been so since the Roman period. When a whole treatise was devoted to its virtues, Dandelion is his, and Culpeper is entirely serious about a plant most people spend their lives pulling up. The leaves eaten as a salad in spring, the root dug and dried and decocted. He gives it for the liver, for the jaundice, and for opening obstructions, and he notes its powerful effect on the water, which the old country name for it, still current in his day and impolite in ours, recorded with perfect frankness. Agrimony he sets under Jupiter in Cancer, a tall, slender herb with a spike of small yellow flowers on dry banks and field edges. He gives it for the liver above all, and for wounds, and for old sores, in a decoction or a wine. Borage and bugloss are his, and they are the cheerful ones. The old tag held that borage brings courage, and the blue star flowers were floated in wine, made into a conserve, and given for melancholy, for a weak heart, and for a person recovering slowly from a long illness. He is warm about them. Lemon balm he places under Jupiter in Cancer, and quotes the old authorities to the effect that it drives away all melancholy and sadness. The leaves in wine or ale, or made into a simple tea, given for the heart, the spirits, and the stomach. Bees favour it, which was noticed everywhere, and taken to be a recommendation. Hyssop is his aromatic and half shrubby, and he gives it for the chest, and the lungs above everything, made into a syrup with honey for coughs and shortness of breath, and used as a green ointment for bruises. Houseleek is his, the thick fleshy rosette that was deliberately planted on roofs and walls all over Europe. Country belief held that a roof so planted would not be struck by lightning. Country practice split the leaves open and pressed the cool, wet inner surface onto burns, stings and inflamed skin, which works well enough that people still do it. Chicory, which he calls succory, is his, with its extraordinary blue flowers along dusty roadsides. The root and leaves in a decoction for the liver, for the jaundice, and for cooling a heated body, and the leaves bruised and applied to inflammations. Cinquefoil is his, the five-fingered creeping herb of banks and waysides, used for fevers, for loosenesses, and in gargles, and hung about with a good deal of charm lore that he mentions and does not press. The oak is his, and though it is a tree rather than a herb, it earns a full entry. The bark powerfully binding, decocted for bleedings and loosenesses, and used as a wash and a gargle. The acorn and the inner bark for other purposes. He notes what everyone noticed, that the oak is the longest lived and steadiest of English trees, and finds it entirely fitting. Avens is his, sometimes called herb bennet, a modest yellow-flowered plant of hedge banks with a root that smells faintly of cloves. That root was laid in ale to flavour and preserve it, and was given for the stomach and the chest and against infection. Costmary, which country people called alicost for the same reason, is his, a tall grey-green herb with a sharp balsam scent, whose leaves went into all and into strewing, and whose long leaf was, in a good many households, used as a bookmark in the family Bible, which is why it was sometimes simply called Bible leaf. Asparagus is his, and it appears in the herbal as a medicine rather than a delicacy, the root decocted for the water and for opening obstructions. Liverwort he gives to Jupiter, on the plain grounds of the name and the use together, and it went into cooling drinks for the liver and for a heated complexion. And the red rose is his, which completes the small puzzle we left earlier. Conserve of red roses was among the most used preparations in the whole of English medicine, given for the heart, for weakness, for the stomach, mildly binding and comforting, and pleasant enough that it was eaten by people who were perfectly well. Notice, standing back, what kind of house Jupiter keeps. These are not emergency remedies. They are the everyday tonics of a working household, taken in ale and in broth, and in cakes, and in conserves, in small quantities, over long periods. More to keep a person going than to pull them back from anything. In a century where the chief threat to a poor family's health was simply the slow grinding of bad food, cold rooms and constant labor, that was arguably the most useful household in the sky. We turn now, and the light goes out of it, to the cold, slow house of Saturn. Saturn was the greater in fortune, furthest from the earth, slowest in his course, cold and dry, ruling lead and old age, and the bones and the spleen and the skin. His herbs are the dark ones, tough, bitter, slow-growing, often found in shade on old walls, in graveyards and damp ditches. They bind rather than open. They dry rather than moisten. Several of them will kill you. Comfrey is his, and it is the great one, broad-leaved and rough, with a thick dark root that is white and slimy within. The old name is knitbone, and the use follows the name. The root grated and made into a thick paste with water was bound over a broken limb and set hard as it dried, holding the bone while it mended. The leaves bruised and applied for sprains, bruises and deep soreness. Culpeper gives it a full and confident entry, and it was one of the most used plants in England. Solomon's seal is his, arching and shade-loving with its rows of small white bells hanging beneath the stem. The root was the part used, made into an ointment or a poultice, and its reputation was for bruises. He records the country belief that it would take away the marks of a blow within a very short time, and notes, with the driest possible delivery, in whose households such bruises most frequently required removing. Horsetail is his, that odd-jointed rush-like plant of damp ground that looks as though it belongs to an older world, which it does. Binding and drying, used for bleedings, for wounds, and for complaints of the water. Fumitory is his, fine-leaved and grey with small dull purple flowers, growing in cultivated ground. He gives it for the liver, the spleen and the skin, in decoctions and in the cleansing drinks taken in spring. Mullein is his, that tall woolly candlestick of a plant that stands on waste ground and dry banks. The leaves and flowers were given for the chest and for coughs, and the leaves, being soft and thick, were used as dressings and, in country districts, for a good many other purposes for which soft material is required. Shepherd's purse is his, small and unremarkable with its heart-shaped seed pods, and its whole reputation is stopping bleeding, inwardly and outwardly, which is exactly what a Saturnine binding herb ought to do. Ivy is his, dark and evergreen and slow, and he gives it cautiously, for old sores and for the head, and warns against the berries. The medlar and the sloe are his, the two hardest and sorest fruits of the English hedge, both of them binding, both used for loosenesses of the bowels, and the sloe famously requiring a frost before it is fit for anything at all. And now let us turn to the part of his house that Culpeper handles with the greatest care of anything in the entire book. There were plants in England that killed, and he did not pretend otherwise, and he did not leave them out. That decision is worth pausing on. A man who has been accused of putting dangerous knowledge into ignorant hands might reasonably have chosen to omit the poisons altogether. He included them, ascribed them so that a reader could recognize them, and told the reader plainly to leave them alone. Deadly nightshade he describes with its dull purple bell and its glossy black berry, and he is unambiguous. The berry has killed children who took it for a cherry, and it is not to be meddled with. Henbane, sprawling and pale and clammy and evil-smelling, was used in his century in tiny quantities for pain and for sleep. And he says clearly that the quantity is everything, and that the margin is small. Hemlock, tall and smooth-stemmed with its purple blotches and its fine fern-like leaf, he treats with complete seriousness, noting how easily it is mistaken for harmless plants of the same family, and how little of it is required. Black hellebore, the Christmas rose, was one of the standard violent purges of classical medicine, and he passes on its uses while making it plain that it is a fierce and dangerous remedy that no ordinary household ought to attempt. The yew he mentions as a tree to be avoided entirely, standing as it does in every English churchyard, poisonous in almost every part. There is something admirable in this. He believed the poor should have medicine, and he also believed they should be told the truth about it. And he did not think the second thing cancelled the first. Throughout the book, wherever a plant is strong, the entry carries its warning, plainly worded and placed where a reader will actually see it. 3 more of the cold house before we leave it. Knapweed, tough and wary on rough grassland, used for wounds and for sore throats and for bruises. The mosses, which he groups together and gives to Saturn on the strength of their slowness and their shade, used for bleedings and in a few old preparations that had drifted down from earlier centuries. And Bistort, whose twisted root gave it its name, powerfully binding, given for loosenesses and for bleeding. There is one further thing to say about Saturn, and it is the thing that most interested his own century. Saturn was the planet of melancholy. In the old scheme, black bile was his humour, cold and dry, and an excess of it produced the condition that the 17th century thought about more, and wrote about more, than almost any other. Robert Burton had published his enormous Anatomy of Melancholy in 1621, and it had gone through edition after edition. Everybody knew what melancholy was. It was heaviness of spirit, fearfulness without cause, a turning inward, a loss of appetite for the world, and the treatment, in the astrological herbal, is a matter of simple opposition. Against the cold, dark heaviness of Saturn yew set the Sun and Jupiter, marigold, rosemary, St. John's wort, borage, balm, motherwort, the conserve of red roses, the cheerful ones, the bright ones, the ones taken with wine and with company. Culpeper's entries for those plants are full of phrases about driving away sadness, comforting the heart, and making the mind cheerful, and he means them literally, as prescriptions. It is worth noticing what such a prescription actually asks of a person. Go out into the garden in the sun, pick flowers, make something sweet with them. Take it with a friend over a glass. There are worse things to be told to do when the world has gone grey, and it was being told in print, in English, for 3 pence in 1652. We turn now from the plants themselves to the kitchen, and to the small, everyday craft of turning a basket of leaves into something that would keep. A list of plants and their virtues is of no use whatever to a person who does not know what to do with a basket of leaves. This is where most herbals stopped, and where Culpeper's went on. And it is the practical reason his book worked in ordinary houses when grander ones did not. He told his readers how to make things. It begins with the gathering, and he is particular about it in the way that all the old herbalists were particular. Gather in dry weather. Wait until the dew is off the plant, or the drying will go wrong and the whole batch will spoil. Take leaves when the plant is coming into flower, since that is when it is at its strength. Take flowers when they are newly open and not yet fading. Take seed when it is ripe and hard. Take roots in the autumn when the growth above ground is dying back, or in very early spring before it starts, since that is when the strength of the plant has withdrawn into the ground. Then the drying, which is where most household stocks were ruined. Not in the sun, which draws the virtue and the color out together. In a shaded, airy place, a loft or an upper room with the window open, spread thin on paper or on cloth, or tied in small loose bundles and hung head downward from a beam. Small bundles, not large ones, because a thick bunch will heat in the middle and go moldy without any sign of it on the outside. Turn what is spread. Once it is properly dry, and it must be properly dry, put it away in boxes or paper bags or sealed pots, kept from damp and from light, and label it, because a dried leaf looks a great deal like another dried leaf by February, and renew it every year. A herb kept past its season, he says, loses its virtue, and there is no point in dosing a sick person with last year's dust. Let us turn now to the preparations themselves, which is the whole art of the still room, and which he sets out in the same plain way. The simplest is the infusion. Hot water poured over the leaves or the flowers, covered, and left to stand until it has drawn. Nothing more. This is what you do with the soft, aromatic, delicate parts of a plant, because boiling would drive off exactly what you want. Chamomile, mint, balm, elderflower, thyme. Next is the decoction, which is for the hard parts, the roots and the barks and the seeds, where a gentle steeping will not reach the goodness. These go into cold water and are brought slowly to a simmer and held there, sometimes for a long while, sometimes until the liquid has reduced by a third or a half. Comfrey root, elecampane, oak bark, licorice. From either of those you can make a syrup, and the syrup is the great household preparation, because a syrup keeps. The strained liquid is returned to the fire with sugar, or with honey if sugar is beyond the household's means, and boiled gently until it thickens and will coat the back of a spoon. Poured hot into a clean jar and stoppered, it will hold a year or more. This is how a family put by elderberry against the winter cough, or violet for a child's chest, or horehound, or coltsfoot. And it is how a bitter medicine was made agreeable enough that a sick person would actually swallow it. A conserve is simpler still and needs no fire at all. Fresh flowers or leaves, picked clean, beaten in a mortar with 2 or 3 times their weight in sugar until the whole becomes a stiff paste, then potted and covered. Conserve of red roses, conserve of rosemary flowers, conserve of cowslips, a spoonful taken as needed. Half medicine and half sweetmeat, and children were rather in favor of it. Then the oils, which take patience. Fresh herb, wilted for a day so that the water in it will not spoil the mixture, packed into a glass jar and covered entirely with olive oil, then stood in a sunny window for weeks. The oil slowly draws out what the plant has to give. St. John's wort turns it deep red. Chamomile turns it gold. Strain it off through a cloth. Press the last of it out of the herb. And if you want it stronger, pour that same oil over a fresh batch and begin again. From an oil you make an ointment, and this is the workhorse of the whole system. The strained oil warmed gently with beeswax until the wax melts, then poured into pots and left to set. More wax gives a firmer salve, less gives a softer one. In poorer houses the fat was whatever was to hand, mutton fat or lard rendered clean. And the resulting green ointment went onto every cut, chap, burn, sore and bruise in the household. A plaster is the same idea made stiffer and spread on a piece of leather or thick cloth, to be warmed and laid against the skin and held there. A poultice, which the old books call a cataplasm, is quicker and cruder and often better. Bruised fresh herbs, or herbs boiled soft, sometimes thickened with bran or oatmeal or bread, laid warm on the place and bound with a cloth. Cabbage leaves wilted at the fire. Chickweed boiled. Bruised comfrey. Distilled waters required equipment, and a still was not beyond the reach of a comfortable household, which is why so many inventories of the period list one. The herb and water go into the vessel. The heat is kept low and steady. The vapor rises into the head and runs down the cooled arm and drips into a receiver. Rose water, lavender water, eyebright water, mint water. These were used as medicines, as washes, as flavorings, and as small luxuries, and the making of them was one of the accomplishments a woman of any standing was expected to have. Beyond these there were the sweetened pastes called electuaries, the single doses of the same rolled into a lump and called a bolus, the pills rolled on the tile, the little dried lozenges called troches, the medicated vinegars, and the mixture of honey and vinegar called oxymel that was given for the chest all over Europe. And in the ordinary run of a poor English house there were the drinks. Herbs steeped in ale, herbs boiled in milk, a posset made by curdling hot milk with oil or wine and dosing it with whatever was needed, a caudle thickened with egg and spiced, and given to a woman after childbirth, or to anybody weak and cold and in need of comfort. Notice what is not in that list. There are no spirits in it, or almost none, because distilled spirit was expensive in that century, and the alcoholic tincture that a modern herbalist would reach for first was not the ordinary tool of a poor English kitchen. Notice also what the actual costs are: sugar, honey, beeswax, oil, a little all. The herbs themselves are free. That is the arithmetic the whole book was built on. Let us turn now to who was actually reading it, because the answer is not quite the one the title page implies. The English physician was bought by men, and it was very largely used by women. The care of the sick in a 17th century household was women's work, unpaid, unremarked and constant. The still room was theirs. The receipt book kept in the family, copied and added to and passed from mother to daughter, was theirs. When a child was feverish at 2 in the morning, it was not the head of the household who was awake with it. Culpeper seems to have understood this perfectly well. He wrote in plain English, without the assumption of a classical education. He explained everything from the beginning. And in 1651 he had published a directory for midwives, addressed directly to women, on pregnancy, childbirth and the care of infants, at a moment when almost nothing on those subjects existed in English for the people who actually did the work. It attracted criticism, some of it on grounds of propriety, and it went on selling regardless. If you look at surviving copies of his herbal from the 17th and 18th centuries, the marginal notes are frequently in women's hands. A remedy tried, a dose adjusted, a note that this served for the boy in such a winter, a receipt copied in from a neighbor on a blank flyleaf. The book was not read. It was used and added to and argued with in kitchens for generations. Let us turn now to the shape of the year that all of this fitted into, because the household that used his book was working to a calendar, and the calendar was the plant's and not its own. The year began, for these purposes, in a bare and hungry February, when almost nothing was growing and the shelf held only what had been put by. This was when the winter syrups were drawn on hardest, the elderberry and the coltsfoot and the horehound, and when a household discovered whether it had made enough in the autumn. March and April brought the first green, and with it the cleansing drinks that every English family made after a winter of salt meat and stored roots, nettle tops, dandelion leaves, cleavers, watercress from a clean stream. These were half food and half medicine, and entirely welcome, and the belief that the blood needed cleaning after winter, whatever its theoretical basis, was attached to a practice that was doing something quite real about several months without fresh vegetables. May brought the flowers, and the flower work is delicate and cannot wait. Violets and primroses and cowslips for conserves and syrups, picked over by hand, beaten with sugar the same day. Hawthorn blossom. The first roses towards the end of the month, gathered in the morning for rose water and conserve of red roses. June and July were the heaviest weeks of the whole year. This is when the leafy herbs come into flower and are at their strength, and when the drying loft filled up. Chamomile, elderflowers, which have to be caught in a narrow window and go over in days. St. John's wort at midsummer, into the oil jar and onto the sunny sill. Lavender, marigold, mint, sage thyme, hyssop, marjoram, all cut and hung. The stills working, every flat surface in the upper rooms covered with paper and drying herb. August and September turned to seed and fruit. Fennel, dill and caraway seed threshed out and stored. Elderberries picked and boiled down. Sloes after the first frost. Rose hips. Hawthorn berries. The syrups made now were the ones that had to last until spring, and the sugar or honey they took was the largest single expense of the household's medical year. October and November were for roots, dug once the top growth had died back and the strength had gone down into the ground. Comfrey, illecampane, burdock, dandelion root, washed, sliced, dried slowly, stored in paper. And then December and January, when nothing grows and nothing can be gathered. And the whole point of the previous 10 months becomes apparent, because this is when people fall ill. Culpeper's book is, among other things, a set of instructions for keeping that calendar. It tells you the month for every plant in it. A family that used it properly was not consulting it in a crisis. It was consulting it in June, so that there would be something on the shelf in January. He also recommended, in the plainest terms, that people grow what they could, not a great physic garden with beds and paths and a wall, which was beyond almost everybody, but a strip by the door, a corner of the vegetable patch, a few pots on a sill. Chamomile, calendula, sage, rosemary, thyme, mint, hyssop, feverfew, lemon balm, lavender. Almost all of them are easy. Most of them come back every year without help. Between that handful and the hedge at the end of the lane, an ordinary family had the raw material for the great majority of the remedies in his book, and the whole cost of it was the sugar. We turn now to the last of it, and to a winter in Spitalfields that he did not come out of. The final years were extraordinarily productive, and it is difficult to read them now without a certain unease at the pace. Between 1649 and his death, he produced the translation and its enlarged editions, the book on midwives, the book on the astrological judgment of disease, the herbal itself, the enlarged herbal, and a considerable quantity of translation besides. He rendered classical and contemporary medical works into English one after another, working with Peter Cole in Cornhill, who printed everything he wrote, and seems never to have hesitated. He was doing it while ill. The chest wound from Newbury had never healed properly. He smoked constantly, and the cough had become consumption, which is what that century called the wasting disease of the lungs that we now know as tuberculosis. Anyone who has read much 17th century biography recognizes the shape of it. The long decline, the good days and the bad ones, the work continuing between them because there is no sense in stopping. He died at his house in Red Lion Street, Spitalfields, on the 10th of January, 1654. He was 37 years old. He was buried in the new churchyard near Bethlehem, at Moorfields, on the edge of the city he had spent his working life in. It was a burial ground for people who were not being buried by their parish in the ordinary way, crowded and unfashionable, and it was in use for something like a century and a half. It was built over long ago and forgotten. When the ground was excavated in the 21st century, during the construction of a railway beneath London, thousands of burials came up out of it, and among the names recorded in the old registers of that ground is his. His individual grave has never been identified, and almost certainly never will be, which is a fitting enough resting place for a man who spent his life insisting that ordinary people were worth attending to. Alice survived him, with their daughter Mary, and she did what mattered. She kept the papers. What followed was a long and slightly disreputable afterlife. His name sold books, and publishers noticed. Within a year or two of his death, works began to appear under his name that he had certainly not written, assembled from scraps, from other men's writing, and from outright invention. Alice authorized some of them and disowned others, and the distinction was not always respected. For the rest of the century, the Culpeper name was attached to a great deal of material of very mixed quality. And underneath all that noise, the actual book kept selling. It was reprinted through the remainder of the 17th century. It was reprinted throughout the 18th. In 1708, an abridged edition was printed in Boston, in the Massachusetts colony, and it is generally reckoned to be among the very first medical books printed anywhere in what would become the United States. That is a remarkable journey for a 3-penny pamphlet from Cornhill. It went into the hands of colonial households who had no physician within a week's travel, and it was consulted, in exactly the spirit its author intended, by people who had nothing else. In the 19th century, the publishers dressed it up. New editions appeared with colored plates and gilt bindings, and the word complete in the title, and the small cheap thing became a handsome parlour volume, which would have amused him and possibly annoyed him. In the 20th century it was reprinted again and again, and by the time the herbal revival of the 1920s arrived, his name had become the name of the tradition itself. When Hilda Lyell opened her herbalist's shop in London in 1927, she called it Culpeper, and nobody needed the reference explained. It has never been out of print. Not once, in 370 years or so, has there been a moment when you could not buy a copy of that book. Let us be honest about the reckoning, because he would have been. A great deal of what he believed was wrong. The planets do not govern plants. The four humours do not govern bodies. A number of the remedies in his book do nothing at all, and a few of them, taken as written, would do harm. He was a man of his century, and he was wrong in the ways his century was wrong. And some of it was right, and right by accident, in ways nobody could have unravelled for another 200 years. Willow bark for fever and pain. Foxglove, which he knew was strong and dangerous and did not fully understand. Garlic and honey on a wound. Chamomile for a restless child. Elderberry in winter. Peppermint on a sour stomach. The proportion of his book that has been quietly vindicated is not large, but it is not nothing either. But the part that actually mattered was never the pharmacology. It was the principle underneath it, which was simply that a person has a right to know what is being done to them, in a language they can read, at a price they can pay. He held that in a century that largely did not, and he wrote it down cheaply enough that it could not be recalled. And no college, and no pamphleteer, and no royal charter was ever able to take it back. They did not silence the herbal. That is the whole of it. There is a longer story hidden in those centuries of reprinting, and it is worth a few quiet minutes before we close. For most of the 18th and 19th centuries, English medicine went on organizing itself. Physicians, surgeons and apothecaries slowly consolidated into something recognizable as a single profession. Training became formal, then examined, then licensed by statute. In 1858, an Act of Parliament established a register of qualified practitioners, and from that point onward the word doctor meant something legally specific in Britain, which it never had before. Everything Culpeper had objected to was, in one sense, strengthened by all of this. The gate got higher. And in another sense he had already won the argument that mattered, because the language question never came back. Nobody after him seriously proposed that English medical knowledge should be kept in Latin to protect the public from it. Medical books in English multiplied from the 17th century onward, and never stopped multiplying, and the domestic medicine manual became one of the standard fixtures of the English household, right through to the enormous family health encyclopedias of the Victorian period and beyond. His own book sat quietly underneath all of that, being reprinted. It went to the colonies with settlers. It went into the hands of people in remote places who had no other resource. It was in the cabins of the American frontier and in Australian farmhouses and on ships. Wherever there were people with no doctor, somebody had a Culpeper, because it was the cheapest thing available, and because it described plants that could actually be found. The 19th century added the color plates and the word complete to the title. and made it a handsome thing that people gave as presents. The 20th century, when the herbal tradition in Britain was at its lowest ebb, took it up again as the emblem of what had nearly been lost. When Hilda Lyell founded the Society of Herbalists in London and opened her shop under his name in 1927, and when Maud Grieve published her own great modern herbal a few years later, the line back to a Spitalfields apothecary was entirely deliberate and entirely acknowledged. And there is one more small modern chapter. When the ground of the old burial place at Bethlehem was opened up for the railway works beneath London, the archaeologists who worked on it spent years on the remains and the records, patiently reconstructing who had been buried there and how they had lived and died. Thousands of ordinary Londoners, most of them poor, most of them anonymous, most of them exactly the sort of people who had queued outside a shop in Red Lion Street. They were studied with great care, and what was learned from them went into the public record. He would have approved of that entirely. It is, in a slightly unexpected form, precisely the thing he spent his life arguing for. Attention paid to ordinary people, and the findings written down where anybody can read them. And so we come to the end of our evening. We began with a small book on a table, cheap paper going brown at the edges, and we have travelled a long way from it. A rectory in Sussex and a boy in the lanes. A university he left without a degree. A storm on the Lewes road, if the old accounts are to be believed, and a grief we can only guess at. A mortar and a pestle, and 7 years of pounding roots. A shop in Spitalfields with a queue of the poor outside it, and no fee asked. A wall of Latin, and a man who took it down. A hillside in Berkshire and a musket ball. And then the plants themselves, hundreds of them, sorted under their 7 planets, the bright ones and the cool ones, the sweet and the biting, the kindly and the dangerous, each with its month and its place and its use. There is nothing here you need to have kept. It has all been written down already, and it has been in print continuously since 1652, and it will still be in print tomorrow. The candle on the table has burned down to very little now. The book is closed and set aside. Somewhere out beyond the window the old streets of Spitalfields have gone entirely quiet, and there is nothing left in this evening that requires anything of you at all. So let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders drop a little further than they already have. Let whatever you were holding on to today go loose, and let the dark come in gently around you. Sleep well. The Quiet Apothecary will be back soon with another quiet chapter. The last of the light settles into the corners of the room, and somewhere in a house that has not stood for centuries, a small book waits on a table for whoever comes next.